November 10, 1864. Cold wind pressed against the adobe walls of Fort Bascom in New Mexico Territory while Christopher Kit Carson rode through the gate to gather the men who would follow him down the Canadian River. Inside the small post, the parade ground filled with movement. Horses shifting at the picket lines, wagons drawn up near the corrals, and stacks of boxed rations under canvas while officers called roll and non-commissioned men checked saddles, carbines, and cartridge belts. General James Henry Carleton's orders on the headquarters table commanded Carson to strike the winter campgrounds of the Kiowa and Comanche, whose raids had burned freight wagons, killed teamsters, and carried off stock along the Santa Fe Trail and its Cimarron branch. Carson stepped down from his horse near the company tents, a compact figure in a worn army overcoat, gray hair showing under his hat, face marked by years on campaign and in the fur trade. And the volunteers watched him move with a calm that matched his reputation. 14 officers and 321 enlisted men of the 1st New Mexico Volunteer Cavalry formed up in ranks. Frontier farmers and herdsmen turned troopers, wrapping scarves around their necks against the wind and glancing toward the artillery that would ride with them. 75 Ute and Jicarilla Apache scouts stood near their ponies, some in fringed buckskin, others in old army blouses or bright trade shirts, rifles in hand and knives at their belts, men who knew the arroyos and ridges between the mountains and the plains where winter villages stood. Near the open gate, 2 mountain howitzers waited behind mule teams under the eye of Lieutenant George Pettis and his crews, who checked fuses, shells, and powder charges and made sure everything was stowed in the order it would be needed when the guns opened. Carson spoke with his officers in low tones, reminded them the column would be far from help once it left Fort Bascom, and made it plain that there would be no wasted ammunition when they found camps along the river. 2 days later, the command left the post and headed east, the adobe walls and small flagstaff shrinking behind them while the line of men, animals, and wagons stretched across the frozen prairie, iron tires and hooves cutting new track beside older trader routes. The column moved in a pattern Carson had used on other campaigns. Cavalry companies near the head, wagons and ambulance in the center, rear guard watching for pursuit, and Ute and Jicarilla scouts fanned out on the flanks and far front to read the country for sign of villages. At each halt, fires came to life from gathered brush and buffalo chips. Coffee boiled in blackened pots, picket lines went up for horses and mules, and sentries took posts beyond the last wagon, their shapes barely visible against a sky that often carried shards of snow on the wind. Following the Canadian eastward, sometimes on the north bank, sometimes on the south, the men forded the river where it spread shallow over gravel bars. Coming up on the far side with boots soaked to the knee and jaws clenched against water that numbed their legs. Snow squalls swept across the open country in sheets that blurred the horizon and slowed the wagons. Yet scouts pressed ahead and returned with reports of old camp circles near the river and fresh pony tracks leading toward the lower valley. On November 24th, the 1st Cavalry reached Mule Springs, 30 miles west of Adobe Walls, and made camp where there was water and a little shelter from the wind behind low ridges. That afternoon, Ute scouts rode in and reported a broad trail leading downriver, with smoke from many fires climbing over the far edge of the plains, more than one village and more than one people sharing the same stretch of the Canadian. Carson decided to move with mounted men and artillery only, leaving infantry and part of the wagon train at Mule Springs under guard, while he pushed on through the night with the forces that could strike quickly. As the sun dropped, the selected companies formed on the open ground, horses snorting in the chill air, breath hanging pale around each muzzle. And officers moved along the line to make certain that every man carried a full load of ammunition. The column set out without bugle calls, hooves thudding in a steady rhythm, wagon wheels creaking softly behind the cavalry, and the scouts took their places ahead as lean silhouettes against a dark sky. Wind cut through blankets and overcoats as hours passed, the night broken only by the dull glow of low clouds, and more than one trooper stayed awake by working numb fingers against his reins and shifting his weight in the saddle. Before dawn on November 25th, the scouts found a point from which they could see the outlines of a large encampment near the Canadian. Lodge poles rising in rows and faint smoke drifting in the first gray light, and they returned to Carson with the news that the enemy lay beyond the next low rise. Carson ordered the cavalry into attack formation, companies spreading so they could descend on the village from more than one angle, and had the howitzers brought forward on ground from which the guns could reach the lodges and any reinforcements coming in. When the lead troopers crested the last rise 2 hours after daybreak, they saw the Kiowa village along the river. 176 lodges standing in straight lines, pony herds scattered near the water, and figures moving slowly between shelters as another winter day began. For a heartbeat, the soldiers looked down in silence. Then officers gave their commands. Men touched spurs to their mounts, and the line went forward at a trot and then at a run, carbines ready as the distance closed. The first shots struck the pony herds and warriors who ran from between lodges toward their horse lines, bullets dropping animals in the dust and sending others crashing through camp ropes and cooking gear, turning walkways between teepees into a tangle of flailing hooves and falling bodies. Dohason and other Kiowa leaders stepped from their lodges to the sight of blue-coated riders already among the outer shelters, and their shouted orders for women and children to move toward safety mixed with calls to younger men to grab bows, lances, and rifles and mount whatever ponies they could reach. Women dragged children toward the riverbank in distant draws, arms loaded with food, robes, and tools seized in hurried trips through smoke and noise, while older men tried to help the weakest members of the village move away from the new killing ground. Many warriors mounted bareback, hair unbound and paint unfinished, but they still rode toward the attack, using milling ponies as moving cover, leaning low over necks, swinging down on the far side of their horses to fire under the animals' bodies at the advancing troopers. Carson saw resistance stiffening with each moment, knew that if he stayed in the maze of lodges, his command risked being swallowed by a force that would grow as Comanche and Plains Apache camps answered the alarm. And he ordered his men to pull back toward open ground between the village and Adobe Walls 4 miles distant. He directed Pettis to bring the howitzers into action against the far end of the camp to slow the gathering of mounted warriors, and shells arced from the short bronze barrels and burst among lodges and along the fringes of the encampment, ripping hide walls, scattering tent poles, and driving metal and earth through bodies and gear. Ute and Jicarilla scouts formed a loose screen between the retreating cavalry and the thickening mass of mounted fighters, riding short bounds, wheeling to fire, then fading back, dropping men from saddles at ranges that made every moment of the withdrawal costly for the pursuers. As the column moved away from the Kiowa village, Comanche and Plains Apache riders from neighboring winter camps came in over ridges and along river bends, answering the alarm in growing numbers until rifle shots and the snap of bowstrings sounded from every side of the withdrawing force. By late morning, the command reached the low hill where the abandoned bent trading post stood, its adobe walls broken yet still thick enough in many places to stop bullets, the old square of rooms and courtyard looking out over rolling ground on all sides. Carson ordered the cavalry to dismount, the howitzers hauled inside the enclosure, and the men to throw up rifle pits and shallow trenches around the fort, turning the shattered post into a rough field stronghold. Troopers and scouts worked with bayonets, plates, and bare hands to pile earth in front of their positions, stacked saddles and packs to thicken those makeshift walls, and dragged fallen timbers to plug gaps where sections of adobe had fallen away, while the ambulance and medical chests were brought into one corner that would serve as a hospital. They finished the first rough line of defenses. Kiowa, Comanche, and Plains Apache riders circled closer, their numbers swelling until they ringed the hill on all sides. organized now under leaders who rode constantly along the moving outer line and chose the points where attacks would fall. Carson's officers estimated that 1,200 to 1,400 warriors were moving against their 330 troopers and scouts, a disparity every man in the trenches and behind the adobe could see simply by lifting his head high enough to look over the lip of his shelter. Dohason, Guipago, Setank, and Setanta led the first major assault from the north, a line of riders rushing toward the hill. Some swinging to the sides of their mounts so that horseflesh shielded them from incoming fire, others firing rifles or arrows from near full gallop as they closed the distance. Carson waited until that charge reached a point he had marked in the ground between the lines, then gave the signal, and a sheet of carbine and rifle fire tore into the attackers at the same moment that Pettis's howitzers sent canisters slamming into the packed front of the rush. Horses and riders went down together, some tumbling end over end, others collapsing where they stood, and the survivors veered off or pulled up short before they reached the outer trenches, streaming away in broken groups that left dead and wounded scattered in a wide arc around the hill. Setanta answered the bugle calls from Carson's line with signals from a captured bugle of his own, echoing commands that added confusion until officers stopped relying on brass and shouted their instructions along the pits where men reloaded and fired in close sequence. Through late morning and into the afternoon, mounted parties tried repeatedly to close, sometimes in broad lines, sometimes in smaller clusters that probed the flanks or concentrated on one short stretch of wall. But each time disciplined fire from the trenches and bursts from the howitzers broke their momentum and sent them wheeling away. The ground around Adobe Walls turned into a churned ring of mud, torn grass, blood, and bodies where men and animals lay together. The still forms of dead warriors and dead horses now used as cover by those who crawled behind them to fire at the defenders or to drag themselves back toward distant ridges. Inside the defensive ring, the wounded reached the hospital corner in a steady flow. Some supported by comrades, others carried on blankets dark with blood, and the surgeon worked under a haze of smoke and dust while the rumble of howitzers and crack of rifles shook dirt from the remaining beams overhead. By mid-afternoon, Pettis reported that his guns had only a small stock of shells left, and that his crews were exhausted from hours of loading and firing, and company officers warned that cartridge boxes were thinning along sections of the trench line where attacks had fallen heaviest. Carson saw that warrior numbers still remained high, and understood that once the howitzers fell silent, repeated rushes could press in close enough to crush the position through sheer weight, especially with his horses worn down and many men already bleeding. He decided to withdraw while his force still had the strength to move and enough ammunition to cover a retreat, and he gave instructions for companies to fall back by sections, one part of the perimeter firing while another stepped off toward the west, then turning in turn to shield the next portion as it followed. Warriors tried to block that movement by setting fire to grass and brush near the river, sheets of smoke and flame rolling toward the hill on the wind. But Carson ordered counterfires lit in front of the advancing blaze, and the two walls of flame met and burned out in clouds of ash instead of sweeping through his escape route. The howitzers fired their last rounds in support of the first stages of the withdrawal, shells exploding among riders who pushed closest as they saw the line begin to move. Then the guns were limbered up and hauled away by mule teams whose drivers walked beside the wheels with carbines ready. Step by deliberate step, the column left the hill and moved back through the country it had fought over all day. Scouts and selected troopers turning often to fire at riders who pressed the rear and flanks until, with light fading, they reached the burned remnants of the morning's Kiowa village. There Carson ordered more destruction, with men setting fire to unburned lodges and to stacks of buffalo robes that could not be carried, determined to deny that wealth to any future war party. While Kiowa Apache Chief Ironshirt stood in front of his teepee in full regalia and refused to leave, dying there under the bullets of the advancing scouts. When darkness settled over the Canadian Valley, the command pushed onto the point where the supply train and infantry waited. And before midnight, the battered cavalry and scouts rode into a new camp where fresh fires, rations, and unspent ammunition meant the difference between survival and collapse. As surgeons moved from one wounded man to another and officers finished their counts, they found that 6 men had died in the fight and 25 were wounded, while reports from scouts and the bodies visible on the trampled ground around Adobe Walls fixed Indian losses at 60 killed and wounded. The next day, warrior bands appeared on a distant ridge and watched the army camp but did not launch another full attack. And after giving his men that single day of rest, Carson ordered the march back toward New Mexico, leaving the ruins of Bent's Post and the blood-soaked ground around it to the Kiowa, Comanche, and Plains Apache who had met his column and forced it out of their winter country. October 21, 1867 through the late 1860s. By the time winter turned to spring after the great fights along the Canadian River, battered war parties moved across the southern plains with a sharper sense that United States soldiers would keep coming as long as raids struck freighters and frontier settlements. Kiowa, Comanche, and Plains Apache families broke their winter circles and followed receding snow lines northward with the buffalo. Lodge poles swaying on travois behind ponies, children riding wrapped in robes, women balancing heavy loads on their backs while warriors rode the flanks and watched the horizon for bluecoats and scouts. In Comanche camps south of the Arkansas, men who had ridden against Carson told younger fighters how artillery had torn horses apart on the open flats, how disciplined rifle fire had beaten back charges that had once carried everything before them. And those stories mixed pride and anger in equal measure. Farther north, Southern Cheyenne and Arapaho survivors of the Sand Creek Massacre carried their own memories of ambushed lodges and soldiers shooting down women and children, and the news of those killings traveled from campfire to campfire across the plains until almost every band had a story of betrayal to balance against its own raids and victories. Along the Arkansas River line, officers at Fort Larned, Fort Dodge, and other posts watched reports pile up on their desks. Each message listing stolen stock, burned wagons, missing mail, and dead settlers or freighters, and every new sheet of paper underlined how little the existing system of scattered forts and ad hoc campaigns had done to stop the violence. Civil War regiments mustered out of Eastern service left the frontier with fewer troops, yet wagons on the Santa Fe Trail and stage lines carrying passengers and mail increased year after year, pulled by the promise of trade, mining, and new farmland beyond the old borders. Railroads crept westward across Kansas in steel lines that threw sparks into dry grass and sent black smoke across country that had once only known the dust of hooves, linking river towns to markets farther east, and making it easier for settlers to reach lands that federal officials still called Indian country. Politicians and generals in Washington studied a map and saw the southern plains as a wide belt where they wanted to confine nomadic peoples to fixed zones, remove them from the main emigrant routes, and open the surrounding land for ranches and farms, and they talked more often of reservations that would concentrate entire nations inside drawn boundaries. For the Kiowa and Comanche, the idea of living forever inside painted lines on a surveyor's map clashed with generations of riding where grass and water dictated the seasons, crossing wide distances between the Red River, the Arkansas, and the staked plains in search of game and stolen stock. Yet the pain of recent winters also weighed on village councils because soldiers had burned more than one camp, destroyed horse herds and cut down supplies that families needed to survive. And elders understood that any path that might guarantee food, rifles, and powder for their people deserved to be heard, even if it carried hidden dangers. In 1867, word passed through the posts and to the agencies that a new commission had been created to talk with Southern Plains tribes at a place in Kansas where federal power would appear not in the shape of a charging column, but as long lines of wagons loaded with rations and trade goods. Medicine Lodge Creek lay in rolling country south of the Arkansas, with timber along the stream banks, wide grasslands beyond, and a sky that seemed to press down on everything in a flat blue sheet. And it was there that commissioners planned to gather Kiowa, Comanche, Kiowa Apache, Southern Cheyenne, and Arapaho leaders for a series of councils. White tents went up first near the stream, army canvas in neat rows under the direction of officers and civilian officials who arrived by wagon and stage, their trunks full of papers, ink, and formal clothing for treaty days, their servants carrying folding chairs and camp tables into place. Stacks of flour, sugar, coffee, bacon, cloth bolts, and manufactured goods accumulated under tarps, guarded by soldiers whose bayonets glinted in the sun, while carpenters built a rostrum and rough benches where speeches would be made and translated into words that could cross the distance between two worlds with very different priorities. From the south and west, long columns of riders and travois moved toward the appointed meeting place, seen first as dust on the horizon, and then as extended lines of ponies, riders, women, children, and dogs approaching with the slow, steady pace of people who had made long journeys before. Kiowa chiefs Dohason and Guipago rode near the front of their people, their hair braided and wrapped, their clothing chosen with care to show power and dignity. Lances carried upright, shield covers bright in the sun, accompanied by younger warriors whose faces showed curiosity and suspicion in equal measure. Comanche leaders such as 10 Bears and Horseback came with their own bands, each lodge circle holding families who understood that this journey might shape where they could ride and hunt for the rest of their lives, yet also knew that ignoring the invitation could bring further military campaigns against their winter camps. Southern Cheyenne chiefs, including men who had seen relatives die at Sand Creek, rode in with carefully arranged parties, their presence a quiet statement that they had not forgotten what soldiers had done but were willing to listen to promises that might bring peace and time to rebuild shattered communities. As the various peoples arrived, their lodges went up along different stretches of the creek, each camp arranged according to tribal custom, with central council teepees, sweat lodges, and lines of shelters radiating out toward the grazing areas where pony herds spread over the grass. Interpreters moved constantly between the white encampment and the tribal camps, men who spoke English and one or more native languages, carrying messages about meeting times, conditions, and the expectations of commissioners who wanted all chiefs of note present when the councils opened. The opening day of the main council saw the creek bottom fill with people, warriors in full paint and feathered bonnets, elders wrapped in robes, women holding small children or standing in tight groups, and soldiers lined up in dress coats behind the commissioners as a symbol of the authority that stood behind the words that would be spoken. United States flags hung behind the raised platform, cloth rippling in the prairie wind, and beneath them sat the civilian and military figures charged with reaching agreements that would, on paper, end raids on the Kansas frontier and confine the tribes to reservations in Indian territory. Introductions moved slowly through interpreters, each name and title passed from language to language with care, so that Kiowa, Comanche, Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Apache elders would know who spoke and what power he held, and so that commissioners could mark which chief carried influence among which group. One by one, the tribal leaders came forward to speak, each according to his nation's custom. Some addressing the commissioners from the rostrum, others choosing to stand on the ground with supporters nearby, their words rising in strong voices that carried down the line of benches. 10 Bears, an elder Comanche chief whose people had ridden the plains before any fort stood along the Arkansas, spoke of the freedom his nation had enjoyed when buffalo filled the country between the Red River and the Platte, when trails belonged only to the herds and to the riders who hunted them. He pointed to the railroads pushing west and the towns that sprouted along them, to the white fences and plows cutting Kansas earth, and he warned that if his people were pressed into too small a space, if hunters were allowed to slaughter the buffalo herds inside those bounds, then no piece of paper could feed their children. Satanta, a Kiowa orator whose words often carried both threat and dark humor, described raids on the trail as acts of war against those who had crossed agreed lines, made plain that his people knew how to strike wagons and stock, and then acknowledged that endless fighting against a nation with factories and railroads would eventually bleed the Kiowa dry. He asked for iron plows, wagons, guns, and steady rations in exchange for moving his people south of the Arkansas onto a reservation, for schoolhouses where boys could learn to read the white man's marks, and for a firm promise that no settlers and no unlicensed hunters would be allowed inside the lands set aside for the tribes. Cheyenne speakers recounted the killings at Sand Creek, described how soldiers had flown a flag of truce and then opened fire on a village that believed it had surrendered, and they demanded that no such treachery be repeated if their bands agreed to live within the boundaries that the commissioners proposed. The commissioners listened, took notes in cramped handwriting, and responded with prepared speeches that praised the native leaders' courage, promised friendship from that day forward, and assured them that the Great Father in Washington wished only to protect them and to prevent more bloodshed on both sides. Draft treaty terms described large reservations in Indian Territory south of the Kansas line, with boundary descriptions that followed rivers and survey lines, and provisions that outlined annual distributions of clothing, tools, farming implements, and food for years into the future. Other clauses stated that no white man would be allowed to settle on the reservations or to hunt within their limits without permission, and that the United States would build agency houses, schools, and mills for the tribes that agreed to live under the new arrangement. As the documents were read in English and then translated into Kiowa, Comanche, Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Apache languages, some elders nodded slowly, understanding that something permanent was being shaped, while others stared ahead, their faces set, weighing whether promises given in one season would still be honored in another. Signatures and marks came over 2 main days in late October of 1867, with each chief stepping forward to touch pen to paper or to make a drawn symbol while interpreters spoke his name aloud, and while tokens, medals, or flags were handed over as physical reminders of the agreement. Guns fired ceremonial salutes, and commissioners shook hands with men whose warriors had killed teamsters and soldiers only months before, declaring that a new path had opened that would end raids and reprisals, stabilize the frontier, and allow everyone to live in peace if the terms were kept. In the camps along Medicine Lodge Creek, nights after the signings were filled with talking around fires, chiefs explaining the terms to their followers, women asking whether promised rations would be enough to replace missing buffalo meat, and young men weighing whether life as reservation farmers could ever match the pride they felt riding with lances and rifles over open country. When councils broke up, the tribes did not instantly abandon their roaming, because buffalo still moved in great herds across the plains and warriors still felt obligations to avenge old killings and to prove their courage. Yet the idea of fixed agency points in Indian Territory began to shape parts of their seasonal swings. White newspapers in Kansas and farther east greeted the Medicine Lodge treaties as signs that the southern plains would soon be safe for settlers and railroad crews, and they reprinted treaty clauses promising that all raids north of the borders would cease and that any hostile band could be punished as treaty breakers. However, men who moved freight wagons and men who guarded stage stations watched the trails through 1868 and 1869 and saw that war parties still hit isolated trains, stole mules and oxen, and sometimes killed or captured anyone they found far from forts because hunger in the villages and anger over old wrongs still drove raiding parties out. In Washington and in Army headquarters on the plains, the persistence of raids convinced officers that some bands would never accept confinement unless forced, and new campaigns were planned that struck winter villages on the Washita and elsewhere, burning lodges, capturing women and children, and killing warriors who tried to defend their families. Each new raid by soldiers, each new destruction of a camp, cut into the confidence that treaty terms would be honored. Because from the tribal perspective, the promised peace had turned into scattered agreements that federal agents pointed to on paper, while troops in the field operated under orders to punish any village accused of harboring raiders. On the other side, each stage robbery, wagon train attack, or raid on an outlying ranch gave state politicians and frontier newspapers fresh reason to demand that the army crush the resistance and clear the plains for cattle trails and settlement, with editorials that described nomadic tribes as obstacles to progress. Agents assigned to Kiowa and Comanche agencies in Indian Territory, at places such as Fort Sill, found themselves trying to persuade chiefs to bring their people in for regular rations, while also reporting that many younger warriors slipped away to hunt or raid, crossing lines that commissioners had drawn but could not enforce without constant military presence. As years passed after Medicine Lodge, buffalo herds that had once darkened the horizon began to thin, not only due to tribal hunts, but also because commercial hide hunters had spread across the plains, killing thousands of animals per season to feed the demand for robes, leather, and industrial belts in eastern factories. Officially, the treaty terms forbade white hunters from entering reservation lands, yet enforcement was weak and often absent, and some officers and agents quietly welcomed the slaughter, believing that without buffalo, the tribes would have no choice but to rely on rations, farming, and obedience to agency rules. Families in Kiowa and Comanche camps saw more bony ribs on the remaining buffalo, watched herds split and scatter under constant pressure from hunters, and listened as elders pointed out that, despite treaty promises, white men with heavy rifles and supply wagons now appeared deeper in the heart of the hunting grounds each season. Along the Canadian and the Canadian's tributaries, trading outfits and hide buyers traveled south from Kansas railheads with wagons piled high with ammunition, coffee, flour, and cheap goods. And they built small clusters of buildings at points that gave access to the richest remaining herds, expecting to profit from the final wave of slaughter. Each such cluster, whether a line of sod structures or a few wooden houses, stood as a sign that agreements made at Medicine Lodge Creek did not guide all who came west, because the men who organized these ventures cared far more about hides and profit than about the boundaries drawn on a map or the words spoken at a Kansas council ground. In tribal debates, voices hardened, some chiefs insisting that they had kept their side of the treaties and that it was time to pressure agents and officers to remove the unauthorized hunters from reservation lands, while younger warriors argued that only direct action against the hide men would show that the Kiowa, Comanche, and Cheyenne still defended their country. Council fires in camps near the Red River and along the Staked Plains saw intense discussions about how far to go and whom to strike, whether to attack only isolated hunters or to target the larger settlements where hide buyers stored their goods and hides in thick-walled buildings. The legal language drafted at Medicine Lodge had not imagined the scale of the buffalo hunting industry that exploded in the early 1870s, nor the technology that made its killing so efficient, with heavy Sharps rifles throwing large bullets far across the plains and railroad cars waiting to move bundled hides toward eastern markets. What had been written as promises on paper now existed in a world where capitalist incentives, new weapons, and a growing tide of settlers and cattlemen eroded any practical protection for tribal lands, and the gap between treaty words and lived reality widened with every new hunting camp that appeared within the old Comanche and Kiowa range. Among the names that hunters and traders began to pass around campfires was a familiar one from the days of the first fight on the Canadian. The name of a place where Adobe Walls had once sheltered a trading post and where the ruins still stood above the flats. a spot now considered ideal as a base for men who wanted to take hides from the surrounding herds. In the years that followed Medicine Lodge Creek, pressure from all directions pushed toward that place. From railroads carrying hunters west, from army officers urging tribes into smaller spaces, and from warriors convinced that they needed a decisive strike to show that their homelands were not just empty spaces to be sliced and sold. By the early 1870s, the fragile hope that treaty lines alone could shield the southern plains from the full force of those pressures had faded, and the next stage of the struggle began to gather around the old site whose name would soon return to every mouth that spoke of war between buffalo hunters and the tribes who still rode out over the high grass. In the spring of 1872, iron rails reached the site that would become Dodge City, and the new railhead sat waiting at the edge of the remaining northern buffalo range like a wide open mouth ready to swallow hides, bones, and meat. Survey crews had left straight cuts through the prairie, section lines and grades carved into land that had long seen only trails made by hooves and wagon wheels, and now trains rolled in with freight cars full of flour, coffee, rifles, and ammunition. Then rolled out loaded with carcasses, hides, and passengers who talked constantly of easy money. The town that grew around the depot at Dodge City started as a handful of buildings near the tracks, rough lumber structures thrown up as fast as saws and hammers could work. But it expanded rapidly as saloons, dance halls, stables, and warehouses appeared, each one feeding or profiting from the flood of buffalo hunters who came in from the plains. By that year, the great herds north of the Arkansas had already taken heavy losses from years of commercial hunting, yet thousands of animals still crossed the short grass between the Republican River and the Arkansas, and Dodge City became the main funnel through which hides and robes from that belt moved toward eastern markets. In wooden offices just off Front Street, men who had never fired a shot at a buffalo sat at desks under ink-smudged maps and signed contracts with hide buyers, railroad agents, and buffalo hunters, calculating returns on every load that reached the railhead behind tired teams. Hunters with names that would later stand out among plains. Stories stepped off trains and wagons into Dodge City's dust. Men such as William Billy Dixon, a lean former Army scout with a steady eye, and a young bartender and gambler named Bat Masterson, who soon learned that buffalo rifles could bring good pay for a man who could shoot straight. In the saloons at night, talk revolved around the number of hides taken that day, the distance to water out on the prairie, and the rumors that the richest herds now lay south of the Arkansas in country that treaty lines had marked as tribal hunting ground for Comanche, Kiowa, and Southern Cheyenne. At the gambling tables, men like Charles Rath and A.J. Wright watched the hunters' money cross the veldt and calculated how much more they could make by meeting those same men farther south, closer to the herds, with trading posts that sold powder, lead, coffee, and liquor without the long haul back to Kansas. North of the treaty line, skeletons of thousands of buffalo already whitened on the prairie where earlier seasons of heavy killing had stripped meat and hides, leaving ribs and skulls to bleach in the sun, and freight wagons loaded with bones rattled toward railheads so factories could grind them for fertilizer and sugar refining. South of the Arkansas, herds still moved in heavy bands over the Canadian River country and the staked plains, animals drawn by water and grass that had not yet been disturbed by constant rifle fire. And it was into that zone that the next wave of hidemen now aimed themselves. During the winter of 1872 and through 1873, more hunting outfits crossed the Arkansas line with heavy Sharps rifles, each weapon a single shot but throwing a large caliber bullet with force that carried far over the flats, turning distant silhouettes into easy targets for anyone who had patience and skill. A standard outfit moved with wagons, skinners, a cook, and hired shooters, the wagons filled with provisions and ammunition, kettles, tarps, axes, and camp tools, barrels of water or whiskey lashed in place beside crates of cartridges packed in sawdust. When hunters reached a likely stand, they unhitched and took positions along low rises or in the lee of shallow draws, using the land as a shooting bench, while skinners sharpened long knives and spread canvas where stripped hides would be stacked once the killing began. The first shot into a herd usually took a buffalo cow or bull near the edge, chosen so that the animal would drop in place rather than run, because the goal was to keep the herd calm, to make the nearest animals merely look around, uncertain, while the hunter worked the breach, wiped the hammer channel, and fired again into another target. On clear days, a skilled shooter could drop dozens of buffalo from one stand before the survivors scented danger enough to break and run. Each shot followed by a dull thud in flesh, dust rising from fallen bodies and the steady clack of the heavy breech lever as the shooter worked through his ammunition. Once the rifles went silent, skinners moved out with carts and teams, walking among heaps of dead weight, driving their knives along the spine and around the legs, peeling hides in long ripping motions, tossing the thick skins onto sleds or wagons and leaving carcasses to rot where they lay, unless tongues and a few choice pieces of meat were wanted for camp use or sale. Skinners who worked under the sun from morning until dark came back to camp soaked in blood and grease, hands cramped around knife hilts, faces burned by wind and light. Yet the stacks of folded hides around the wagons made clear why they kept at the labor, each pile representing dollars waiting at Dodge City. From the perspective of Comanche and Kiowa hunters, those same stands looked like deliberate waste, because only the hides went north in quantity, while meat that could have fed many winter camps drew wolves, coyotes, and insects, turning familiar hunting grounds into rank fields of spoiled flesh and buzzing swarms. Scouts for the tribes began to report greater numbers of white hunters moving along the Canadian and its forks. Men with ox teams and wagons loaded with hides, men who built small camps near springs and creek crossings, and who dug pits for trash and erected racks for drying pelts. In village councils, older warriors described riding within sight of such camps, watching through spyglasses as the hide men worked, listening to rifle shots that echoed through the air all day, and coming in with news that the new hunters had rifles able to smash an animal down at distances beyond those of most tribal weapons. While that information spread in the camps, merchants in Kansas made final preparations for a permanent foothold deep in the Texas Panhandle, selecting the site where the old Adobe trading post had once stood as the best place for a new settlement. The old Bent and St. Vrain post at Adobe Walls had been abandoned since the 1840s and its remains weathered by time. Yet its position on a low rise above a branch of the Canadian, roughly central to rich buffalo range, made it an attractive site for an outpost that could serve hunters working a wide radius. Charles Rath and A.J. Wright saw that advantage clearly from their office in Dodge City, and in early 1874 they organized freight trains to haul lumber, hardware, barrels of whiskey, sacks of flour, coffee, sugar, and other goods to the old post site, hiring hunters and teamsters who knew the route. Wagon trains carrying those supplies jolted out of Dodge across the Arkansas, followed old trader trails southwest, crossed broken country of arroyos and low ridges, and finally dropped into the Canadian Valley where the crumbling adobe walls of the original post still clung to the hillside. Workers cleared debris, leveled pads for new construction, and began raising frame buildings faced in sod where walls needed extra thickness, laying out the small settlement that would come to be called the second Adobe Walls, a cluster of structures in an arc facing the open country. The main store of Rath and Wright stood as the largest building, with thick sod-backed walls, a plank roof, and shelves inside for provisions, ammunition, and trade goods that would be sold to hunters in exchange for hides, bones, and cash when they had any. Nearby, the firm of Myers and Leonard built a second store, smaller but still solid, carrying similar goods and hoping to catch its share of the trade that Rath and Wright wanted to dominate, since buffalo hunters often favored whichever counter extended the best credit or prices on any given week. Between and slightly forward of the two stores, James Hanrahan erected a saloon that included space for gambling tables and a lunch counter, a place where men could buy whiskey, beer, or coffee, eat rough meals, and spend evenings talking, arguing, and bragging over cards and dice when they came in from the killing grounds. A blacksmith shop such as James Langton's operation completed the core of the new settlement, with forge, anvil, and racks of tools ready to mend broken wagons, reset shoes on tired horses and mules, and repair the metal hardware that hunting camps wore out under constant strain. Around these buildings, corrals of posts and brush went up for stock, and rough dugouts and tents sprouted on the slopes where skinners, teamsters, and hunters made their temporary homes while they were based at Adobe Walls. Each shelter crowded with bedrolls, rifles, and gear. By late spring of 1874, the new Adobe Walls had become a fixed point in the middle of the southern buffalo range, a place where dozens of men moved through every week, some staying long-term, others arriving only to resupply before returning to distant camps. Hunters rode in with long beards, cracked lips, and clothes stiff from dust and blood, some leading strings of spare horses, others driving wagons piled high with hides tied down by ropes and rawhide, each load representing hundreds of buffalo shot over previous weeks. Inside the stores, Rath, Wright, Myers, and Leonard weighed hides on scales, argued over grades, and entered figures into account books, then turned to cases of ammunition, stacks of flour sacks, barrels of salt pork, and crates of coffee to fill each hunter's list, writing down new debts when a man's load did not quite cover his needs. At Hanrahan's saloon, glasses clinked on scarred boards, while men drank to warm themselves after long days in cold wind, stood around a piano when someone passed through who could play, and traded stories of near misses with charging buffalo, bad weather, and earlier fights along the trails. Billy Dixon sat among them at times, a quiet man who listened more than he spoke, his reputation as a marksman already spreading, while Bat Masterson, younger and more talkative, moved easily between serving at the bar and planning future hunts that would take him deeper into the Comanche and Kiowa range. In the blacksmith shop, the steady ring of hammer on iron never really stopped while camps were active, hooves lifted on stands for reshoeing, wagon tires reheated and refitted to shrunken wooden wheels, and tools reforged after they had chipped or bent under rough use. The small settlement's daily routine looked on the surface like the life of any frontier trading point, but it stood on land that treaty councils had once reserved for the hunting of tribes now pushed back toward Indian territory. And the evidence of that original purpose showed in trails, old camp circles, and the buffalo herds themselves. Beyond the rise on which the building stood, the Canadian Valley opened into flats where hunters set up distant stands, and the sound of Sharp's rifles often reached Adobe Walls as sharp, individual cracks that carried clearly through the dry air, marking the steady work of men killing animals for distant markets. From the west and south, Comanche and Kiowa scouts watched this development with alarm, reporting to village councils that permanent white structures now stood where only ruins and grass had been. Structures that served the very hunters who were stripping the herds that villages depended on. Young warriors, already angry from years of treaty violations and army campaigns, saw the new settlement as a direct challenge, a clear sign that white enterprise did not intend to stop north of the Arkansas. And their talk around campfires turned increasingly toward the need for a strong blow against the hide men. Older leaders weighed those voices, aware that the United States had grown stronger with every year, yet also aware that patience had produced little more than broken promises and poorer hunting grounds. And several council fires burned long into the night while men debated what should be done concerning Adobe Walls. Within the new settlement, however, confidence rested heavily on the heavy rifles stacked behind counters and leaning in corners, and on the belief that any raiding party would break under fire from men who could reach targets at distances the tribes had not yet faced in concentrated fashion. Hunters spoke of earlier skirmishes where small groups of raiders had ridden into range, and where a few calm shots from Sharp's guns had sent them away with losses. And those stories built a sense that the white men at Adobe Walls possessed not only strong buildings but also the firepower to hold them against any rush. By the time grass stood tall again in 1874 and the last traces of winter snow had vanished from shaded draws, the pattern was set, with herds shrinking faster under constant shooting, hunters moving farther each week to find concentrations of animals, and Adobe Walls functioning as the central node that tied the killing grounds to the markets across the plains. On one side stood traders, skinners, shooters, and teamsters, who viewed the buffalo as profit measured in stacks of hides and kegs of bone, working from a base that looked permanent and secure. On the other stood Comanche, Kiowa, and Cheyenne families who saw their food, clothing, and cultural foundation being cut down under that very system. The gap between those two realities narrowed each time a trail rider spotted distant hunters at work or a hide wagon passed within sight of a camp circle, and each new report carried to councils added weight to the argument that the enemy now had a clear, exposed target in the form of the buildings and men at Adobe Walls. In the late weeks of that spring, the wind over the Canadian carried the smell of drying hides from the settlement and the familiar scent of buffalo from the remaining herds. And under that same sky, warriors and medicine men in distant camps made decisions that would carry them toward the trading post with a scale of force no hunter there had yet seen. In the warming weeks of late spring in 1874, Comanche, Kiowa, and Southern Cheyenne camps stood in the broken country north of the Red River. Their lodges clustered along draws where water still ran and scant timber gave some shelter from the wind. Buffalo herds that had once moved across that country in a dark and constant mass now came in scattered bands with wide, empty spaces between them where hunters had stripped hides in earlier seasons and left bones whitening on the prairie, and warriors returning from long rides reported more such killing grounds every month. Scouts who watched the high plains to the north told of wagons, piles of hides, and heavy rifles at work in the valleys of the Canadian and its branches, and they used the name Adobe Walls when they described the new knot of stores and saloon buildings that had risen near the remains of the old trading post. In the lodge circles, the news carried a sharp edge because men and women understood that every new load of hides taken from their hunting grounds meant fewer robes, fewer dried meat stores, and fewer animals to feed children and elders through the winters that would come. When council fires were lit, older chiefs reminded their listeners that promises made at Medicine Lodge Creek had included protection of tribal hunting lands from white intrusion, and they pointed out that the hunters at Adobe Walls were breaking those terms in full daylight and with regular supply trains from Kansas. Younger warriors spoke more bluntly and with greater anger, insisting that patient waiting had brought only more raids by buffalo hunters, more tracks of oxen and wagons across the plains, and more traders who stood behind counters stacked with ammunition taken from the same buffalo that had once belonged to the tribes alone. Into that tense and crowded world stepped a Comanche medicine man whose name had begun to spread across the camps even before the hunters built their first permanent walls on the Canadian, a man many knew as Isa Tai. He was not old, still carrying himself with the energy of early manhood, but he had already gathered respect by performing ceremonies that followers said brought storms or healing, and by speaking in ways that made warriors feel that unseen power stood close enough to be summoned. In the spring of 1874, riders carried word that Isa Tai would hold a great medicine performance in a large Comanche camp, and that he had a message regarding the buffalo hunters and the future of war on the southern plains. Families from scattered bands began moving toward the chosen site, their travois cutting new grooves in the turf, ponies sweating under loads of poles and folded lodge covers until a circle of teepees stretched across the flat, with war lodges and a medicine lodge standing near the center. The medicine lodge itself rose with special care, its poles set and covered according to instructions that Isatai gave. Through assistance, its interior cleared of ordinary objects, and its entrance marked so that everyone knew that what took place inside would concern the fate of entire tribes. When the people gathered, warriors sat in rings near the central lodges, elders and chiefs in the innermost circle, younger men and women beyond. And further out clustered children who understood only that something important was underway and that every adult had his or her eyes turned toward the same point. As the sun dropped toward the horizon, drummers began to beat a steady rhythm near the medicine lodge, and singers lifted their voices in songs that spoke of power, journeys, and protection, each line carrying across the camp until the entire circle seemed focused on the space near the central fire. Isatai stepped into that space painted and dressed for his role, his face marked with colors that he said the spirits had chosen, his hair arranged carefully, and his movements measured so that each gesture seemed part of a pattern rather than a casual motion. He spoke first of the buffalo, of the long years during which the herds had fed the people and given robes, shelter covers, and tools, and then of the recent seasons when hide hunters had shot animals by the hundreds and piled skins for sale while leaving meat to rot on the grass. He told them that the powers he served had seen this and were angry, and that they had given him knowledge of how to drive the white hunters from the plains and restore the balance between buffalo, grass, and people, if the warriors would accept his guidance. His words came with certainty rather than suggestion, and he laid out a clear promise that he could make the white man's bullets harmless to those who followed his instructions, that he could cause enemy guns to fail, and that the warriors who rode to war under his medicine would not fall to the weapons that had killed so many in recent years. To strengthen his claim, he brought forward demonstrations that supporters later described in detail, having a marksman fire while he stood without visible armor, and manipulating the moment so that powder failed or bullets did not strike as witnesses expected, each such display drawing sharp breaths and murmurs from the watching circles. He said that he could catch bullets with his hands, that he could turn them aside, that he could close the mouths of rifles so that they would not spit their fire when pointed at his followers, and he repeated that the time had come to meet the buffalo hunters on ground of his choosing with this new protection in place. Around the outer edges of the gathering, elders watched closely, listening to every word and measuring the claims against their long memories of past fights, while many younger warriors felt rising excitement at the thought of riding into battle with shields not only of rawhide and wood but of medicine that would nullify the enemy's strongest advantage. When Isatai finished, chiefs and war leaders stepped forward to answer, some speaking in support, saying that the people had asked for a sign and that this man's medicine might be the answer. Others asking more pointed questions about how such promises would stand against the heavy rifles and disciplined firing they had seen at places like the Canadian River fight against Kit Carson. The debates continued into the night, but the tone had shifted because a man who claimed that bullets could not harm those who followed his guidance gave many who were tired of retreat and shrinking hunting grounds a reason to believe that a bold strike could succeed where earlier efforts had failed. In the days that followed, word of Isatai's promises spread beyond the immediate camp, carried on the lips of riders who visited Kiowa and Southern Cheyenne villages, and the idea of a great joint war party began to take shape. Larger than the raids that had struck isolated wagon trains or distant ranches. Messengers rode to Kiowa elders, including men such as Lone Wolf and Big Bow, and to Southern Cheyenne leaders whose bands still hunted and camped on the southern plains, telling them that the time had come to strike a heavy blow that would show the buffalo hunters and their backers that the tribes would defend what remained of their country. The messengers explained that this would not be a scattered campaign of small parties, but a single focused effort that would gather warriors from many bands under a combined leadership, guided by the medicine of Isatai and aimed at a target that symbolized the entire hide trade pressing into tribal lands. In discussions that followed those visits, one name kept rising whenever men asked where that blow should fall. And that name was Adobe Walls, the settlement ringed by herds and hunters that stood in the path of migration and within country that treaties had once recognized as tribal hunting ground. While the medicine man's reputation grew and invitations spread, another figure sat in councils and listened. A man whose name carried weight among Comanche war parties for reasons rooted not in ceremony, but in proven fighting skill, Quanah Parker. Quanah had come of age in years when Comanche bands had ridden freely between the Red River and the Staked Plains, and he had made his name in raids and fights that demanded both courage and careful planning, giving him standing among warriors who valued a leader who could bring them home entire as well as victorious. His heritage as the son of the Comanche leader Pita Nocona and the captive white woman Cynthia Ann Parker placed him at a crossroads in more ways than one, and he understood both the ferocity of tribal resistance and the deepening strength of the United States, which grew with each new railroad and fort. When he heard Isatai promise that bullets would not harm those who rode with him, Quanah did not dismiss the claims outright, but he measured them against his own experience of gunfire, the way bullets cut flesh and bone, regardless of who held the rifle, and he weighed the risks of staking many lives on such assurances. In council, he did not speak against the medicine man's plans because he knew that faith in spiritual power held a central place in the hearts of the people, but he insisted that any great war party also follow sound tactics, choose the time and direction of attack carefully, and make use of the speed and skill of mounted fighters. Kiowa warriors had their own medicine traditions and respected their spiritual leaders, yet many of their war chiefs saw practical advantage in a combined strike under a man like Quanah, who had shown repeatedly that he could read the ground, move unnoticed, and seize the moment when an enemy was weakest. Southern Cheyenne leaders listened to the accounts of Adobe Walls given by scouts who had seen it, the number of buildings, the corral lines, and the traffic of rifles and provisions. And they added their voices to the growing agreement that this was the right target for a large alliance. A formal war council came together in the Comanche camp, with representatives from the main participating tribes, including prominent Kiowa and Southern Cheyenne figures, along with Comanche war chiefs and the medicine man who had called them all there. The council circle formed inside a large lodge where the central fire burned low enough to reduce smoke, but bright enough to light the faces around it, and men of rank sat shoulder to shoulder, drawing robes more tightly around themselves as they prepared to shape a plan that would send many of their young men into danger. Scouts who had ridden near Adobe Walls spoke first, describing the settlement as a line of several stout buildings on a rise above a stream, with corrals nearby, and a shifting population of hunters, skinners, and tradesmen that usually counted in the few dozens rather than the hundreds. They explained that heavy rifles stood behind those walls, that wagons arrived at intervals with supplies and bullets, and that the men inside slept soundly after long days of shooting, drinking, or work, leaving the buildings most vulnerable at first light when few watchers sat awake with rifles ready. War chiefs weighed that information and compared it to raids they had made in the past against wagon trains and frontier settlements, noting that Adobe Walls lay far from any large fort, that soldiers would need considerable time to reach it if it were attacked, and that a swift strike could destroy the buildings and the men before help could arrive. Isatai then laid out his part of the plan, insisting that the war party must assemble in strength, approach the settlement quietly, and come within sight of the buildings before dawn, with warriors ready to charge as the first gray light touched the roofs and corral rails. He repeated his assurance that bullets would not harm those who rode in with his medicine, that he would be present to call on the powers that had promised to protect them, and that the rifles at Adobe Walls would fall silent or shoot harmlessly once the charge began. Quanah spoke later in the council, his words measured, focusing on movement and tactics rather than ceremony, describing routes that would allow a large body of riders to approach unseen through folds in the ground and breaks along the Canadian, and to form on the high ground that rose west and south of the settlement. He stressed the need for discipline, for warriors to hold back from firing too early, for the first rush to hit the buildings in one hard blow instead of in scattered individual charges, and for some groups to concentrate on killing the hunters before they could slam doors and take up strong positions. Kiowa leaders added their own suggestions, speaking of how to use fast riders to swing around the flanks and block any attempt by men at Adobe Walls to escape on horseback, and how to deploy skilled riflemen on nearby ridges to pick off anyone who tried to run for cover across open ground. Southern Cheyenne warriors spoke of past experiences attacking stockades and small forts, pointing out that if defenders could be kept from organizing their fire, even thick walls might not save them, especially if attackers could set fire to roofs and corrals, forcing men inside to choose between smoke and bullets. As the night wore on, the council shaped all of these strands into a single plan: to gather a large alliance drawn from multiple tribes, to move toward Adobe Walls in stages so as not to exhaust the horses, to set a camp beyond sight of the settlement where women and older men would wait, and then to advance a chosen band of warriors to launching positions before dawn. The chiefs agreed that the attack must come quickly and without warning, with riders descending on the buildings at a full charge, shouting, firing, and intending to overwhelm the hunters before they could do more than snatch a rifle and stumble from their bunks. Once the plan had been described and agreed upon, it fell to the camp to assemble the men and the supplies that such a venture demanded, because large war parties required preparation on the same scale as hunts or seasonal moves. Women in the circles began to sew, repair, and decorate shirts, leggings, and moccasins, to mend bridles and saddle covers, and to fill parfleches with dried meat, ground meal, and other food that warriors would carry with them for the approach and the expected return. Young men took their horses to water, checked hooves, rubbed down backs, and selected the animals that would carry them on the first charge, often choosing their fastest mounts and speaking softly to them during the night as if reminding them of the work ahead. Weapon cleaning became a constant sight in the camps as warriors sat near fires with rifles laid across their knees, running rags through barrels, checking flints, caps, and firing pins, and testing the edges of knives and the points of lances that would be used in close work if defenders broke. Painters worked on shields, bodies, and horse flanks, adding designs that represented power and protection, while singers practiced the songs that would carry warriors into the fight, each rhythm familiar yet charged with new purpose because of the scale of the coming engagement. When the time came to move, the war party's departure stretched over a long morning, with groups forming under their respective leaders, then merging into a single body that covered the ground as far as the eye could see. A mass of riders, spare horses, and a few pack animals carrying extra ammunition and food. Families remaining behind watched the dust cloud follow that movement and felt the double pull of pride and fear, knowing that the men riding away would be placing themselves in the path of rifles and cannon, yet also knowing that every season with fewer buffalo and more hunters left the people with less room to avoid direct confrontations. The march toward Adobe Walls followed routes chosen for concealment and access to water, keeping to low ground when possible, crossing ridges at dawn or dusk when silhouettes would be harder to distinguish from any other distant shapes, and avoiding the more used trails where hunters or scouts might travel. Scouts ranged ahead and to the sides, watching for signs of army patrols or hunter parties, scanning the horizon for dust plumes or the metallic sparkle of sunlight on gun barrels, and returning with small adjustments to the planned route as needed. At halts during the march, war leaders met briefly to confirm direction and timing, while Isatai performed smaller ceremonies, renewing his promises that the medicine remained strong and that the powers he called upon would stand between the warriors and the bullets of the men at Adobe Walls. As the war party moved deeper into the Canadian Valley, scouting reports became more detailed, describing the exact arrangement of the buildings at Adobe Walls, the presence of wagons and corrals on the surrounding slopes, and the routine of the hunters who moved between the stores, the saloon, and their shelters. Scouts counted the defenders they could see entering or leaving buildings at different times of day and brought back estimates that reassured the chiefs, because the numbers remained small compared to the wide line of riders now moving toward them. Spotters also noted that the hunters often appeared relaxed, that they sometimes gathered in the saloon for long stretches of drinking and cards, and that many slept deeply after such nights, with only a few men stepping outside when dawn approached to see to stock or other chores. Taking all of this into account, the War Council chose the final assembly point in a series of low ridges and draws, within riding distance of Adobe Walls yet hidden from view. A place where the main body of warriors could wait while smaller groups moved forward into their starting positions. The day before the planned attack, the Alliance reached that final camp and made necessary adjustments, sorting warriors into frontal assault groups, flankers, and men who would take positions on higher ground to fire into the settlement once the first rush had broken the initial defense. That evening, as the sky darkened and the last light slipped from the edges of the prairie, warriors sat with their horses, checked gear for the last time, and spoke quietly with one another, each man knowing the risks but committing himself to the task. Near the center of the assembly, Isatai led a final ceremony, calling the chosen men into a circle, passing his hands over them, speaking words that invoked protection and victory, and reminding them that he had been given the power to shield them from the enemy's bullets. Quanah and the other war leaders moved through the ranks afterward, not with grand speeches but with direct instructions, pointing out who would ride where, who would signal the start of the charge, and how far each group should press toward the buildings before wheeling or dismounting. The stars shone clear above the camp, while the sounds of preparation slowly faded into the quiet necessary for men to rest before a hard ride, and only the occasional low nicker of a horse or the soft crackle of a fire betrayed how many fighters were gathered in that temporary city of war. In the last dark before morning, warriors rose and tightened saddle cinches in near silence, paint still stark on their faces and bodies, weapons slung where they could be reached without hesitation, and horses snorting as they sensed the tension in the hands that held their reins. Scouts slipped out ahead once more to take positions from which they could watch Adobe Walls, as the first hint of light touched the eastern horizon while the main body began to move. File after file of riders easing toward the ridges above the settlement, ready to break into a full charge when the signal came, and to trust in both their own courage and the medicine that had brought them this far. June 25th, 1874 began before daylight in Dodge City, with wagon drivers moving through the dim streets to harness teams for the long haul south toward Adobe Walls. Along Front Street, lamps still burned in a few saloon windows, their yellow light falling across muddy ruts and piles of discarded packing straw. While outside the freight yards, men pulled on boots, tightened belts, and checked chains and yokes in the gray half-light before sunrise. Oxen stood in lines with their heads down, breath steaming, wooden yokes resting on heavy necks while teamsters cursed and coaxed them into position, fastening bows and tug chains, then walking the line to look for cracked hooves or sore shoulders that might fail on the trail. Near a row of freight sheds, stacks of buffalo hides waited to be loaded eastward, stiff bundles giving off a rank animal smell that mixed with wood smoke and coal smoke from the locomotives in the rail yard. But a different lot of men were busy around wagons headed the opposite direction, toward the killing grounds and Adobe Walls. Cases of rifle cartridges wrapped in paper and cord, Kegs of powder, flour sacks, barrels of coffee beans, boxes of canned goods, and bolts of coarse cloth went into the beds of those southbound wagons under the eye of clerks who marked each item in ledgers, knowing that every pound would be paid for either in cash or in hides taken later in the season. Billy Dixon stood beside one of the loaded outfits, a lean figure in plain frontier clothing, hat brim pulled low as he watched a skinner throw a bundle of bedding up beside a crate of ammunition, then checked that his own Sharps rifle was secure in its scabbard inside the wagon, and that his revolver sat easy in its worn holster. He had already spent seasons out on the plains as a buffalo hunter and scout and knew exactly what he would face on the Canadian. Long days of crawling into position on open ground, steady shooting, and nights under canvas or stars. But this trip felt heavier than usual because reports of Indian movement south of the Arkansas had grown more frequent as the year advanced. Across the yard, younger Bat Masterson, not yet the lawman he would later become, finished strapping a bedroll to a second wagon, and then stepped inside the freight office to settle accounts with Charles Rath's man behind the counter, arranging credit for supplies that would be repaid in hides when his outfit came in from the range. When he stepped back outside, he traded a few short remarks with Dixon about the road ahead, the spots along the Arkansas where water was still good, and the likely position of the remaining herds. Then lifted himself into the wagon seat and took up the reins, his eyes still showing traces of the gambling hall and saloon lights he had left only a few hours earlier. A shout from a foreman carried down the line, calling for drivers to move out, and the ox teams leaned into their collars as the first wagons rolled, iron tires grinding over stone and packed earth, followed by mule teams pulling lighter vehicles loaded mostly with ammunition and small stores intended for shelves at Adobe Walls. The little train threaded its way past low buildings, past the stacks of hides waiting for shipment, and past groups of men who watched from saloon porches with drinks in hand, some calling out wishes for good luck and fat herds, others placing casual wagers on how many days it would take the convoy to reach the Canadian. Once clear of Dodge City's loose grid of streets, the wagons joined the long trail that crossed the open ground toward the Arkansas River, wheels dropping into old ruts left by earlier freighters and hunters, drivers walking beside the teams with goads and whips, watching carefully for holes that might snap a spoke or turn a wagon. Morning brightened into full light as they reached the river and looked over the broad, shallow waterway, where muddy channels wound between gravel bars and sand tongues. Cottonwood trees lined parts of the bank, and a steady wind pushed ripples across the surface. Teamsters walked the crossing first to test footing, then urged the oxen in, the animals snorting as cold water rose around their legs and bellies while wagons creaked, loads shifted, and more than one man kept a hand braced against a sideboard, ready to push if a wheel sank too deep into the soft bottom. On the far bank, they halted only long enough to dump water from boots and adjust loads that had shifted on the rough approach to the ford, then pressed on south and west into country where low ridges, dry creek beds, and wide stretches of grass took the place of the town's clutter and noise. By mid-morning, the line of wagons moved under a high, pale sky, the sun bringing heat that laid a haze over the prairie, while prairie dogs barked from mounds near the trail and darted down their holes as the teams drew close, and occasional antelope lifted their heads from grazing to watch the slow procession pass. The trail showed signs of recent travel, grooves from earlier hunting outfits and freighters scoring the grass in parallel lines, bits of broken harness and empty cartridge boxes along the way, each trace a small mark of the steady flow of men and material toward the heart of the remaining buffalo range. At midday, the drivers halted near a shallow waterhole where cattails ringed a muddy pool, unyoked the oxen and let them drink in turns while cooks unpacked kettles and hung them over quick fires, stirring simple meals of beans, salt pork, and biscuits that would fuel another stretch of slogging movement. Men ate with tin plates in their laps, sitting on the ground or on wagon tongues. The talk mostly practical while mouths were full, some discussing the price they expected for hides that season, others trading information about which parts of the Canadian Valley still held heavy concentrations of buffalo. The rest of the day's travel dragged on in a pattern of slow climbs and gentle descents as the trail crossed low divides and shallow draws. Wagon wheels sending up powdery dust that settled on clothes and skin, leaving every man coated in a fine film that would only grow thicker with each passing mile. Toward evening, the convoy made camp on slightly higher ground beside a dry creek bed, where mesquite and scrub provided enough fuel to cook and to warm hands and faces for a short time before sleep, and where the wagons could be pulled into a loose circle with animals picketed inside. Hunters and skinners unrolled bedding under wagons or in the lee of wheels, some stringing canvas tarps for shelter, others preferring open air, rifles laid within reach, boots set where they could be found easily if sudden trouble stirred the camp before dawn. Around one of the fires, Billy Dixon, Bat Masterson, and a few others sat with coffee cups and tin plates, listening to a more seasoned plainsman describe the country they were entering. His voice level as he noted known water sources, stretches where Comanche parties had been seen, and the distance remaining to Adobe Walls. No one in that circle pretended that danger did not exist, yet the talk never turned into open fear because all of them had chosen this work knowing that heavy rifles and thick walls offered a kind of protection, and that the scattered reports of Indians on the move south of the Arkansas still sounded distant compared to the immediate demands of their trade. Night settled around the camp with stars bright in a sky without town smoke or rail yard glow, coyotes calling from somewhere beyond the circle of firelight, horses shifting and blowing softly on their ropes, and guards pacing with rifles on their shoulders, not expecting an attack but following habit built from months on the range. At first light on June 26th, the drivers were up again, feeding teams and tightening harness, rousing men from blankets stiff with dew and pushing the wagons back onto the faint twin tracks that pointed their way toward the Canadian and Adobe Walls. The second day's drive carried them deeper into the Texas Panhandle, across wider expanses of open grass where the land rolled gently and only occasional low bluffs or scattered shrubs broke the view, and where herds of buffalo were less dense than in earlier years but still present in significant numbers. From wagon seats and from the saddle, the hunters watched those animals move, sometimes seeing only a few dozen at a time, occasionally spotting a larger band strung out along a distant ridge, and they marked such spots in their minds as places to revisit once they had unloaded and resupplied at the settlement. Midday brought another short halt for water and food, then the train moved on again. The line stretching and compressing as slower teams labored up gentle rises, dust hanging over the rear wagons, tarps rattling, and men squinting against the glare of sun on pale grass and dry earth. Late in the afternoon, they reached a rise from which the valley of the Canadian opened ahead, the river channel cutting a winding path through the flats with patches of cottonwood and willow along its edges, and, beyond one branch, the low hill where the buildings of the new Adobe Walls stood. From that vantage, the settlement looked small against the vast plain, a short row of thick-walled structures close together with a few outlying tents and dugouts scattered along the slopes, smoke from cooking fires drifting upward and a faint sound of hammering or shouting occasionally reaching the approaching party when the wind shifted. The wagons rolled down toward the crossing in a more relaxed mood because most of the men had been here before and recognized the signs of normal life at the post. The movement of horses in corrals, the figures passing along the fronts of the stores, the distant shine of glass at a saloon window catching late sun. Crossing the Canadian at that point meant guiding wagons through softer sand and gravel than they had encountered at the Arkansas. But teamsters worked carefully, double-teaming on steeper approaches, sending riders ahead to find the firmest bottom and bringing every load safely up the far bank with patience rather than haste. Once they reached the foot of the hill, the train split as different outfits steered their wagons toward the store where they usually did business. Some going to Rath and Wright's establishment, others to Myers and Leonard's, with a few heading first to the blacksmith to schedule urgent repairs. Hunters climbed down from wagon seats and stretched cramped legs, the stiffness of 2 days in jolting vehicles easing slowly as they began to unload hides from earlier stands, stacking them beside store doors where clerks and partners could inspect quality, count bundles, and tally values against existing account books. Inside Rath and Wright's store, shelves already crowded with goods grew even tighter as new cases came in. Men carried in sacks of flour and boxes of cartridges, and the steady clink of metal on wood filled the close air while inventory shifted hands. The smell of leather, cloth, grease, and cold iron mixing with that of pipe smoke. Across at Myers and Leonard's place, measurements and arguments played out in much the same way. Skinners insisting on higher figures for well-cured hides. Storekeepers pointing out flaws and grease spots that would lower grades, each side pushing slightly. Then reaching the compromise that kept the trade moving. At Hanrahan's saloon, men from the newly arrived outfits pushed through the door into a room lined with a plank bar, a few tables, and a narrow shelf where plates and cups stood ready, their boots clattering on the floor as they called for whiskey, beer, or coffee, some wanting to shake trail dust from their throats, others to clear it. Bat Masterson slid behind the bar to help, used to the work and knowing that a few hours of pouring drinks and dealing cards could bring in as much cash as a day of shooting, while Hanrahan watched the crowd with a practiced eye, gauging who might win, who might lose, and who might cause trouble once the liquor took hold. Billy Dixon did not linger over his first drink, instead choosing to step back outside after wetting his mouth so he could look over the settlement and the sky, his gaze traveling past the buildings to the surrounding ridges and flats with the habit of a man who had grown used to checking for distant movement before relaxing. The structures stood close together on the gentle slope, each one built to withstand weather and stray bullets, with roofs covered in sod layers that held heavy weight, and kept interiors cooler in summer and warmer in winter, yet provided their own set of problems if beams under them shifted or weakened. Within Rath and Wright's store and the other buildings, bunks and bedrolls lined the walls with men assigned sleeping spaces according to where they worked, or to the personal arrangements they had made with owners, so that by late evening on June 26th, nearly 30 men and 1 woman had settled into the cramped quarters or into tents and dugouts on the hillside. The woman, the wife of one of the laborers, moved through the day with a different rhythm than the hunters, tending cooking pots, washing clothes when water and time allowed, and keeping her own small area in order in a setting that otherwise revolved almost entirely around male work and talk. As daylight began to fade, most of the hunters who had spent the morning and early afternoon unloading and trading gear turned their attention to preparing rifles and ammunition for the days ahead, sitting under eaves or just inside doorways while they cleaned barrels, checked sights, and refilled cartridge belts. Heavy Sharps rifles leaned in rows against walls or lay across knees, their long barrels showing marks from hard use but kept in good working condition by hands that had come to trust them completely, while men talked quietly of stands they planned to make, the positions from which they would shoot next, and the direction of the herds they had seen on the way in. A few hunters stepped away from the main cluster and walked to the edge of the hill as the sun slid low, looking out over the open land in each direction, noting the quiet of the surrounding country, the absence of visible riders, and the normal pattern of buffalo movement, all of which gave them a sense that no unusual threat loomed nearby. Some mentioned that scouts and mail carriers had spoken of increased Indian activity farther south and west, yet here, at this moment, the sky was clear. The plains lay empty to the eye, and it was easy to believe that whatever unrest might exist remained at a manageable distance from this little set of buildings. Inside Hanrahan's saloon, card games began in earnest as darkness drew on. The sound of shuffling decks, low remarks, occasional laughter, and the clink of coins adding to the murmur of voices while others gathered around the lunch counter to eat plates of meat, beans, and bread, stretching legs and shoulders stiff from the trail. The blacksmith's forge cooled as the evening ended his work for the day. Tools hung carefully on their hooks, stray horseshoes laid aside for later, and the man himself joined the cluster in the saloon or took his meal in a quieter corner of one of the stores, wiping soot from his hands and arms with a rag that never quite came clean. When the games wound down and men began drifting off to bunks or bedrolls, the settlement settled into a kind of rough order, with those sleeping inside the main buildings stacked along walls, some on rough wooden frames with hay or blankets, others on the bare floor, boots tucked under heads or used as pillows. A few chose to sleep outside, either in wagons or under tarps on the hillside, preferring fresh air to the crowded interiors, and they pulled their blankets tight against the night air that cooled quickly once the sun was gone, listening to horses moving in corrals and to the fading talk from the saloon. Inside Hanrahan's place, the long ridge beam that carried the weight of the sod roof had already shown signs of strain in recent weeks, with a slight sag that a few men had noticed and commented on, though busy days had pushed any serious repair work aside, leaving the timber to bear its load a little more heavily each night. Somewhere near midnight, as the last few men finished their drinks and stumbled toward their bunks, the building creaked and settled as wood adjusted under the weight of earth and timbers above. Sounds so common in frontier structures that no one gave them more than a moment's notice. By the time the lamps went out and Hanrahan's saloon lay in shadow, nearly every man in Adobe Walls had stretched out and closed his eyes, the day's labor and movement pulling them down into deep sleep, with no guard posted on the ridges and no alarm rope strung around the settlement's edge. Outside, the sky arched clear and star-filled over the Canadian Valley, a slight wind moving across the grass and whispering against the corners of the buildings, while stock shifted and snorted in their pens and the wagons that had arrived from Dodge City stood silent after their 2-day journey. Inside those thick walls, snores rose and fell, someone muttered in his sleep. A bunk frame creaked as a man rolled over and pulled his blanket higher, and the heavy beam across the saloon ceiling held its burden for a few more hours while the settlement slumbered, unaware that riders and horses were already drawing closer through the darkness beyond the horizon. June 27th, 1874 began in darkness inside Hanrahan's saloon, with men sprawled on bunks and floors under a heavy sod roof that had sagged a little more each week since spring. The long ridge beam running the length of the room carried tons of earth and grass, its ends resting on thick walls, its middle section lifting and settling as temperatures changed. And in the still hours before dawn, that strain finally shifted in a way no one could ignore. A sharp cracking report sounded overhead, wood fibers tearing under pressure, followed by a grinding creak as the beam dropped a fraction and shook loose dirt and bits of sod that sifted down over blankets, faces, and the plank bar. Men jerked awake in the sudden noise, some reaching instinctively for rifles that were stacked near the door. Others throwing off covers and sitting up with hearts pounding, eyes searching the shadowed rafters and the dim outlines of tables and bunks. Someone shouted for a lamp, and in the weak yellow light they saw the ridgepole sagging lower near the center. A visible bow in the timber where one end of a brace had slipped, the weight of the sod pressing down in a way that could not be ignored until morning. James Hanrahan cursed under his breath and began issuing quick orders, telling the nearest men to get on their boots and help shore up the roof before the whole center section came down and buried them in dirt and wood. Billy Dixon pulled on trousers and boots, snatched up his knife and revolver, then followed Hanrahan and several others toward the doorway, stepping over sleeping forms that were still struggling awake, while Bat Masterson rolled off his bunk, grabbed his hat and gun belt, and moved to join them. They opened the saloon door to the night and stepped out into cool air that still held the thin edge of darkness, stars dimming in the east but no color yet on the horizon. The buildings of Adobe Walls just blacker shapes against the sky. Men carried a heavy post and rough planks from a nearby pile, stumbling in the half-light. Boots sliding on dry dirt and loose chips then wrestled the timber inside to brace the sagging beam, grunting as they drove the improvised support beneath it with short, hard lifts. The work took time and strength, with several men straining at once while others steadied the post and watched the ridgepole rise slightly as the new support took its share of the load, dust raining down on their hair and shoulders until the timber seated firmly. When the brace finally held, Hanrahan stepped back, wiped sweat and dirt from his face with a sleeve, and said they would check the roof again in daylight and make a more permanent repair before nightfall. Then waved the men toward the door to grab a breath of air before crawling back into bed. Outside, the settlement lay quiet, corrals dark, wagons just faint outlines along the slope. The two stores and the blacksmith shop crouched under their own sod roofs, smoke from banked fires barely visible as a thin hint in the cool air. Several hunters stepped away from the saloon door for a moment, stretching backs and shoulders, talking in low voices about the beam and the day's work ahead, unaware that the noise inside had changed the timing of everything that would follow. On the ridges west and south of Adobe Walls, the alliance of Comanche, Kiowa, and Southern Cheyenne warriors had already taken their positions in the last hour of night. Horses standing in long lines with reins looped over arms, riders sitting in silence under a sky that was just beginning to pale near the eastern rim. Quanah Parker and other war leaders moved quietly along the front, speaking to small knots of men, reminding them of the plan to hit the settlement as dawn broke, to ride in fast and hard while the hunters still slept, to kill quickly and pull men from their bunks before they could make organized resistance inside those thick sod walls. Isatai remained near the center of the assembly, surrounded by warriors who had placed their faith in his promise that bullets would not cut them down. His face painted in stark patterns, his movements deliberate as he watched for the first faint gray strip that would signal the moment to begin the charge. In the dim light, the riders' bodies formed a dark wall along the ridgeline. Hundreds of figures with shields, lances, and rifles, horses restless, stamping and tossing their heads, breath steaming in the chill. The low murmur of human voices barely audible under the occasional whicker of animals. Below them, the buildings of Adobe Walls showed only as squat shapes on the rise above the creek, without lamps or movement visible at that distance, exactly the picture the War Council had expected, a trading post asleep in the last hour before sunrise. Back at the saloon, Hanrahan and the men who had helped with the beam stepped outside again, this time staying for a few extra minutes in the cool air, some walking toward the corrals to check stock, others standing near the doorway talking softly. The ridgepole problem already fading from their minds now that it seemed stabilized. Billy Dixon walked a short distance from the building and looked toward the eastern sky, gauging the coming light, then turned to glance over the western ridges out of habit, eyes narrowed, not yet seeing anything except the dark line of higher ground against the fainter band of night. Inside the other two stores and the smaller shelters along the slope, most men were still asleep, wrapped in blankets, while Hannah Olds and a few early risers stirred among kettles and gear, planning the morning meal and the routine work that would begin once the sun cleared the horizon. In a wagon drawn up a little separate from the main cluster, the Shadler brothers lay under their covers with a dog curled near their feet, freighters by trade who had bedded down close to their team and load, confident that the thick walls nearby made their position reasonably secure in a region that still held risk. On the ridges, the sky shifted by small degrees, the stars dimming further, the faintest hint of gray sliding under them. and Quanah gave the quiet signal that sent the front ranks nudging their horses forward, forming them into lines that would tip over the slope together when the final order came. Warriors checked weapon straps, tightened belts, adjusted shields on arms, and leaned over to speak last words to friends in the next line. Their faces calm and focused, many of them thinking of Isatai's assurance that their bodies carried protection against the steel and lead inside the buildings. The signal to move came just as the darkness began to thin enough that landforms showed more clearly. A hand motion passed down the line and a shouted word taken up by others. And then the ridge seemed to come alive as riders urged their horses over the crest and into a controlled descent toward the sleeping settlement. From the slope near Hanrahan's door, Dixon heard something different in the distance, a gathering rumble that did not match wind or creek noise, and his head snapped toward the west as the first line of riders broke into view along the top of the ridge, silhouettes thickening until individual horses and men could be seen. In an instant, the mass behind that front line became clear, a long, rolling wave of mounted warriors pressing forward, lances raised, rifles lifted, feathered bonnets and hair whipping in the wind, colors breaking free of the shadows as the light grew just enough to show paint on faces and bodies. For a heartbeat, the sight held him rigid, then he yelled the alarm with everything in his chest, a single sharp cry that carried across the yard toward the stores and upward toward the tents and dugouts on the slope, naming the danger and driving sleepers upright in one stroke. Bat Masterson, standing near the saloon doorway, looked up at the same moment, saw the mass pouring off the ridge, and turned back toward the building in a rush, shouting for men inside to grab rifles and get to the walls, his voice cutting through the last remnants of drowsiness that clung to the bunk rows. Inside the saloon, men still sprawled under blankets scrambled to their feet as the alarm reached them, hands grabbing for gun belts, boots slammed onto bare feet with laces flapping, Sharps rifles dragged from against the walls and from corners where they had been propped during sleep. Outside, riders broke into a full charge, war cries rising in a raw chorus, horses stretching into long strides down the slope, dust lifting behind hooves, the whole front of the wave aimed directly at the cluster of buildings where men were still trying to get into position. Near the freighting wagon, the Shadler brothers jolted awake to the sound of shouting and the growing thunder of hooves, pushed themselves upright under blankets, and for a moment had no clear sense of what was happening, until they heard the piercing cries and saw the leading edge of the charge bearing down. They reached instinctively for rifles and tried to scramble out of the wagon bed, but they had no walls around them, no time to reach a doorway, only open yard and the short distance from canvas to ground. And in the time it took to swing their feet to the edge, the first warriors reached their position. Comanche riders swept past the wagon in the first seconds of the rush, some firing from the saddle, others leaning low to strike with lances or clubs. And the two brothers went down under the first blows and bullets, their bodies and their dog left on the ground beside the vehicle they had believed safe hours before. Across the yard, men who had been outside at the moment of the alarm sprinted for the nearest door, legs pumping, heads lowered as they ran, rifles already in their hands or hanging from slings, with no time to look back at the wave bearing down behind them. At Hanrahan's saloon, Dixon and Masterson reached the doorway as horses closed the distance, dove inside and slammed the heavy plank door with a boom that shook the frame, several hands seizing the bar and setting it in place while others shoved barrels and crates into position as extra bracing. Windows along the front of the saloon received the same treatment, with men dragging whatever solid objects they could reach into place under windowsills, then smashing firing gaps through the sod and plank with axe strokes and knife points, creating rough loopholes only a few inches wide. In the scramble, a few shots went out too soon, pistols cracking as nervous men fired at distant riders from open doorways, but most inside Hanrahan's place held fire until they had some kind of cover and a clearer field of targets through the improvised ports. At Myers and Leonard's store, hunters came awake to the alarm, then heard the first burst of war cries, and they moved as one, dragging themselves from bedrolls, seizing rifles, and hauling heavy merchandise stacks toward doors and windows, shouting for everyone outside to get in while there was still time. One of those outside was Billy Tyler, who had slept nearby and now ran full tilt for the store, rifle in hand, ribs heaving, boots pounding the trampled earth as he covered the last yards to the doorway with warriors nearly on his heels. As he reached the threshold and began to turn sideways to slip through the half-open door, a bullet struck him in the chest, driving him back into the opening, breath leaving his body in a harsh sound, and other hands grabbed him and pulled him inside even as more shots snapped past the doorframe. At Rath and Wright's store, the few men present slammed their own door and dragged sacks and boxes into a crude barrier, then dropped behind counters and kegs, cutting loopholes in the walls with knives and hatchets, knowing they had fewer rifles than the other buildings and that their position would be tested severely. Outside the three main structures, the first rank of attackers reached the yard at full speed, horses blowing hard, eyes wide, nostrils flared, hooves pounding over hard ground, riders firing into doors and windows, some leaning from the saddle to strike at anything that moved. Warriors swung off on the far side of their mounts as they closed, using horse bodies as moving shields in the last yards, then tried to force doors or smash windows with rifle butts and hands, only to find thick sod and solid planks that did not give easily even under repeated blows. At Hanrahan's front wall, some riders pulled up within a few steps of the entrance, pounding on the door with weapons and fists, shouting rage and threats while bullets from inside began to punch back through loopholes and narrow cracks, finding targets at ranges so close that it seemed impossible to miss. Men inside the saloon fired pistols and lever-action rifles at that range, their heavy Sharps guns less useful until the attackers moved back a little, and each shot from within the room at those first close quarters produced a heavy thud against wood, flesh, or bone on the other side. Horses screamed and went down in the yard as bullets broke legs or cut through shoulders, bodies collapsing in sudden heaps that spilled riders onto the ground, some scrambling to regain their feet, others lying still where they fell in the first seconds of the assault. Near the blacksmith shop and the corrals, groups of warriors wheeled and fired from horseback at any figure seen moving between buildings, forcing those who had not yet reached cover to crouch behind wagons or scramble across open stretches under a hail of bullets and arrows that raised little geysers of dust wherever they struck. Along the wall of Myers and Leonard's store, attackers tried to break the windows and batter down the door with rifle stocks, only to be met by muzzle flashes from inside. The defenders firing at such close range that some shots burned powder streaks into clothing and hair before the bullets tore into bodies. The first wave of the attack lasted only minutes, yet in that short span the yard and slopes transformed from a quiet ranch-like scene into a crowded killing ground, with men and animals scattered in twisted positions near doors, fallen horses blocking approaches, and screams of wounded men and animals filling the air along with powder smoke. Inside the buildings, lungs burned from the effort of rapid movement, hands shook from the shock and adrenaline of close combat, and ears rang from the constant concussion of gunfire in confined spaces. Yet the men continued to load and fire through loopholes and doors, driven by the knowledge that any pause would bring attackers through the walls. Gradually, as more and more horses went down close to the buildings and as riders realized that doors and windows would not give way quickly, the front edge of the charge pulled back a short distance out of the immediate range of pistol and shotgun blasts, leaving a belt of dead and wounded animals and men lying within a few steps of every threshold. War leaders called their followers to regroup beyond that cluttered zone, signaling riders to circle wider around the buildings and to use the fallen horses as partial cover instead of charging straight into the storm of fire that had already killed and wounded so many in the first rush. From inside the sod walls, the hunters looked through their narrow firing slits and saw the open ground littered with bodies. The corrals mangled, the Shadler brothers' wagon standing silent near two still forms, and beyond that, further out, lines of mounted warriors wheeling for another try. The sun's rim broke clear of the eastern horizon as that first fury eased, light washing across the Canadian valley, illuminating the smoke, dust, and carnage around Adobe Walls. And every man inside the three main buildings understood that the fight had only entered its next phase, with a larger number of enemies still sitting on their horses, watching and preparing to strike again. The first rush broke apart in a swirl of dead horses and wounded men. And as the sun climbed higher above the rim of the Canadian valley, the fight around Adobe Walls shifted from a sudden stampede to a sustained struggle where weapons and discipline mattered more than the surprise of the charge. Inside Hanrahan's saloon, the air already tasted of powder and dust, a thick haze hanging in the room while men shouted positions back and forth, flattening themselves against walls and taking turns at the loopholes they had hacked through sod and plank. Billy Dixon knelt at one of those gaps with his Sharps rifle braced on a sack of flour, the heavy barrel steady in his hands as he sighted on a mounted man who had pulled up just beyond the belt of dead animals. The target sat sideways in the saddle, lifting a rifle, and Dixon's shot caught him in the body and slammed him backward over his horse's rump. Next to him, another hunter worked a Winchester, the lighter repeating rifle clacking as he cycled rounds into the chamber and sent a string of shots at riders who were trying to pull wounded comrades away from the killing ground in front of the saloon. Brass cases bounced from the breach and rolled across the dirt floor, their number growing by the minute. At Myers and Leonard's store, the men inside had formed their own pattern, 2 or 3 at a time, kneeling at loopholes while others crouched behind them, cutting fresh gaps or reloading spare weapons so that no opening stayed silent for more than a few breaths. Billy Tyler lay still near the door where they had pulled him, blood soaking the boards under his body in a dark patch that widened slowly. No one had time to do more than cover his face with a blanket and step around him, because bullets kept punching into the wall outside and snapping through any crack that a careless man left uncovered. In Rathen Wright's place, the defenders faced a harder fight. Fewer rifles meant that each man had more openings to watch, and the first charge had cost them horses and one man who had been caught running toward the door. They dragged sacks, crates, and barrels into higher stacks under the windows, thickening their walls until the interior of the store looked like a narrow tunnel of goods. Outside, war chiefs rode along the lines of circling attackers, calling instructions in sharp phrases that reached even through the crack of incoming and outgoing fire. Riders who had taken part in the first rush were ordered back to the outer ring to catch their breath and check weapons, while men whose horses had not yet been shot out from under them moved forward to take their turn pressing the attack. Comanche, Kiowa, and Southern Cheyenne riflemen dismounted on the flats, leading their horses back behind shallow rises, then crawled forward with carbines and captured long guns. They found depressions in the ground, behind the bodies of fallen horses, along the edges of old washouts, and began sending fire toward windows and loopholes with more deliberate aim. Bullets slapped into sod walls, chipped splinters from door frames, and sang past any head that rose too high. The thick walls soaked up much of the incoming fire, but a few rounds punched through in unpredictable places, showering rooms with dust and fragments and reminding every man inside that no part of the interior was completely safe. Along the slope below the main buildings, riders on swift ponies worked to cut off any route of escape. They galloped from one side of the rise to the other, watching for a break in the door barricades, ready to chase down anyone who tried to run for the creek or the low bluffs beyond. The yard between the 3 main buildings had become nearly impassable for mounted men. Dead horses lay on their sides with legs twisted under them, saddles skewed, reins trailing in the dirt. One animal tried to rise, failed, and rolled onto its back with hooves churning, then fell still. Several warriors crawled behind those carcasses and used them as shields, resting rifles on the cooling bodies and aiming for any thin slice of light that marked a firing gap in the walls. Inside Hanrahan's, a man at one loophole screamed as a bullet punched through the sod and tore into his shoulder, knocking him backward into the room. Two others grabbed him under the arms and dragged him toward the rear, leaving a scattered trail of blood on the floorboards. Hannah Olds helped pull him into a corner that had been turned into a rough aid station and pressed cloth against the wound while another hunter cut away his shirt with a knife. There was no time for careful surgery. Bandaging meant pressing linen or torn shirt into the hole, tying it tight, and getting the man flat on a blanket, preferably out of the way. Some wounded refused to stay down, dragging themselves back to windows with their good arms, insisting on firing left-handed rather than let the line thin. The heat inside the buildings rose steadily as the sun climbed and more guns fired. Sweat ran down faces and soaked shirts mixed with powder residue and dust into a grim paste. Tongues dried out and more than one man felt a pounding behind his eyes from the noise and strain. Between volleys, a few ran short dashes to water barrels that stood in corners, dipping tin cups and passing them hand to hand. Outside, the creek flowed not far below the hill, but no one could reach it without crossing ground that riflemen on the surrounding flats watched closely. Through his loophole, Dixon saw a cluster of mounted men forming off to the southwest, more organized than the circling rifle parties. A war leader rode at their head with a shield decorated in bold patterns, his hair streaming, his horse one of the few not yet lathered from repeated charges. Dixon called the movement out, and others along the wall shifted their aim. The cluster moved into a trot and then into a run, lances lifting, voices rising in new war cries as they aimed at the gap between Hanrahan's place and Myers and Leonard's store, hoping to find a weak point in the defenders' coverage. Hanrahan himself took position at a window facing that direction, shotgun braced against his shoulder, jaw set. As the riders closed, he waited until he could pick out individual faces, then unleashed both barrels into the leading pair, knocking one man from his saddle and blowing the second back against his horse's neck. The blast signaled the rest of the defenders. Sharps rifles and Winchesters opened up from both buildings, rounds slamming into the charging line. Several horses went down at once, tumbling forward and throwing riders ahead of them. Others reared or swerved suddenly as bullets tore into their bodies, breaking the charge into fragments long before it reached the narrow space between the two structures. A few warriors pressed on despite the chaos, firing as they rode and trying to close the remaining yards, but their momentum had gone. Men inside had already reloaded and fired again, and the surviving attackers wheeled away, leaving more dead and dying men and horses sprawled in the approach. Similar scenes played out along other sides of the buildings. Each new attempt to mass riders and break into the yard met the same answer. Steady, aimed fire from rifles that held their zero, fired by men who had spent seasons learning exactly how to judge distance and hold their sights on the open plains. The Sharps rifles were the heaviest tools in that defense. Hunters treated them almost reverently in the midst of the chaos, keeping the bores clear, wiping fouling from breeches and handling the big cartridges with care. When one of those rifles spoke, it sent a large bullet that punched through flesh and bone with crushing force, dropping men and horses even when the impact came at an angle. At one point, a group of warriors tried a different method. They dismounted in a shallow swale within medium range of the buildings and began crawling forward with rifles, leaving their horses tied behind a low rise. They advanced in short bounds, each man moving when two or three others were firing, using the brief cover of smoke and dust to gain a few more yards. From the loopholes, defenders could see the movement as flickers and dark shapes against the ground. They aimed low, waited until a head or shoulder showed a little too long, then fired. Several of the crawling attackers fell face down and did not move again. Others pressed forward far enough to send more accurate shots into the windows, one bullet smashing a lamp and scattering glass, another drilling straight through a man's cheek and taking part of his ear with it. Inside the rooms, men who were not in the firing line carried spent rifles to a small interior table where cartridges lay in rows. They worked like factory hands, opening breeches, extracting empty shells, slapping in fresh rounds and slamming actions shut, then passing the guns back to the men at the walls. At Myers and Leonard's store, the pressure remained steady on the south and east sides. Warriors had found shallow hollows and tufts of grass that gave just enough cover to fire upward at the windows. Every time someone behind the counters raised his head too high or too long, a bullet snapped close or punched into the wall close enough to shower him with dirt and wood fragments. One man inside the store took a bullet through his hand when he tried to steady his rifle too near the opening. The impact tore flesh and spun the weapon out of his grasp. He cursed and staggered back, fingers hanging loose and bloody. Another hunter shoved a different rifle into the same slot without missing a beat, keeping the line of fire unbroken. The dead horses piled nearest the buildings began to draw flies and the first faint smell of exposed entrails, but that stench was lost in the harsher tang of burned powder, sweat, and hot dust. Outside, the sun climbed toward its midday height, shining down on metal gun barrels that grew hot to the touch and on men who were now fighting in full daylight, every movement exposed. In the open spaces beyond the belt of fallen animals, larger groups of warriors circled at a distance, moving in and out of range as they tested the defenders' rhythm. From that wider ring, volleys of fire came at intervals, forcing men inside to flatten themselves for a moment before they returned fire. Occasionally, a single rider would dart forward from that ring, firing from horseback at a loophole, then swinging away before a return shot could reach him. Those quick probes cost attackers horses and riders whenever the defenders reacted in time, but they also kept pressure on the buildings and made any attempt at repair or movement outside impossible. Inside the stores, the constant stream of casualties began to mount. In addition to the dead Tyler, one man lay with a crushed leg where a bullet had splintered bone, his pant leg already stiff with clotted blood. Another sat propped in a corner, an arm hanging useless at his side after a shoulder wound, his teeth clenched on a strip of leather as someone tightened a bandage. In Hanrahan's saloon, two men who had taken lesser wounds stayed in the fight with makeshift bandages. One had a crease along his scalp that had bled freely at first but already started to cake under the cloth tied tightly around his head. The other had a gouge in his forearm, but he could still work a lever and pull a trigger, so he refused to lie down. Ammo counts became a quiet concern as the morning wore on. Hanrahan called for someone to check cartridge crates and shouted questions to the back of the room. Men answered with rough estimates, yelling that certain boxes were empty and others half gone. Yet the building still held enough rounds for continued defense, and the knowledge that the attackers had no easy resupply kept the defenders pressing the trigger whenever a target appeared. At one point, a bullet punched through the saloon wall and struck a stacked keg. The plug broke, and whiskey began to leak onto the floor. A man cursed at the waste, grabbed a rag and shoved it into the hole to slow the flow. There was no time for more careful repair. The liquid mixed with dust underfoot, turning part of the floor into a slick mess that men had to step over as they moved between positions. Rath and Wright's store experienced a different shock when a bullet smashed through a gap near the roof and hit a sack of sugar, bursting it open. A white cloud filled the air for a moment, clinging to sweat and soot on faces, making several men cough and blink before they could resume firing. Despite these disruptions, the defenders maintained their rhythm. Hunters who had spent years judging distance and wind across open prairie applied those instincts without conscious thought. They adjusted their sights when warriors shifted positions, introduced small holds for rising heat shimmer, and waited for the exact instant when a target presented the largest possible surface. Every time a rider fell or a crawling rifleman went still, the attackers had to decide whether to risk another life dragging him back. At first, many warriors did so, running forward in short bursts, ducking behind dead horses, grabbing a fallen man under the arms and hauling him towards safety under covering fire. As the hours passed and losses mounted, fewer of these retrieval attempts succeeded. On the far edge of the field, women who had accompanied the war party watched from separate positions, some near the main camp, others from ridges that gave view of the fight. They saw horses drop, recognized riders by clothing or the way they moved, and began to feel the scale of the cost in a way that reached beyond numbers. Within the alliance, certain leaders had planned to capture the buildings intact, to seize the stored ammunition, food, and goods along with the men inside. By late morning, that goal had started to look less attainable. The structures stood as solid as at dawn. The hunters inside still fired with the same accuracy. The ring of dead animals and warriors around the walls had grown thicker. Quanah Parker understood that every minute spent in a close siege under that kind of fire increased his losses. He and other chiefs shifted emphasis from trying to crash through the doors to containing the post, harassing it, and waiting for a moment when defenders might break from exhaustion, thirst, or dwindling ammunition. For the men inside, there was no way to read those decisions directly. All they knew was what they could see through narrow openings. Riders circling beyond the main belt of bodies, dust clouds where groups shifted position, occasional fresh charges that never reached the doors with the force of the first. The noise never entirely stopped. Even when volleys eased, sporadic shots cracked from both sides. Horses shrieked again whenever a new animal was hit. From inside, occasional cries of pain marked another wound, cut off quickly as men sank their teeth into leather or cloth to keep from yelling. As the sun approached its height, shadows under the eaves drew shorter, and the light on the flats grew harsher, making every figure stand out more sharply against the ground. This clarity favored the men inside the buildings. Their shooting lanes lengthened, and their sharps rifles in particular gained full advantage of their range. At that point in the long morning, defenders began to pick targets that stood farther out, on ridges and in draws where leaders moved or where groups of mounted men gathered to consult. Each well-placed shot that knocked down an officer or a man with ceremonial regalia carried weight beyond the single casualty. It signaled that no place within sight of the buildings lay outside reach. By midday, the initial belief that warriors could rush the settlement and tear it apart with speed and surprise had vanished. In its place stood a different reality, one in which every advance cost blood and horses, while the men behind the sod walls still held their positions, rifles ready, eyes watching for any new push. The field around Adobe Walls had become a wide ring of fallen animals and scattered bodies, a physical map of the morning's attacks. On one side of the walls stood the buffalo hunters and tradesmen, pinned in place yet unbroken. On the other, the alliance of Comanche, Kiowa, and Southern Cheyenne warriors still circled in numbers, angry and grieving, now forced to decide whether to withdraw out of range or to settle into a longer siege under the unforgiving sun. June 27, 1874. Afternoon heat lay heavy on the rise at Adobe Walls while the battle shifted from charging horses to scattered gunfire and watchful eyes. The sun stood high above the Canadian Valley and beat straight down on the sod roofs, baking clay and earth until the smell of warm turf mixed with burned powder inside the cramped rooms. Men wiped grit from their faces with sleeves already soaked in sweat and turned back to the narrow gaps they had cut through walls that now felt as solid as fort ramparts. Outside, the riders who had led the first rush pulled back toward shallow folds in the ground and low breaks near the creek. War chiefs knew that another full gallop into the yard would only add more bodies to the ground and more empty saddles to the ranks. So they ordered men to find every scrap of cover the flats offered and to use their rifles the way the hunters inside did. Kiowa and Comanche riflemen lay flat behind slight rises, using tufts of grass and old washbanks to hide their shapes. Some slipped into the remains of half-collapsed dugouts and abandoned pits that earlier hunting camps had cut into the slope. Others stretched out behind broken fence lines, toppled posts, or debris from outbuildings that had taken bullets and splinters during the first assault. They steadied their guns on those makeshift rests and aimed upward at the small black mouths of loopholes. Each time a defender let the barrel of a rifle project too far, shots snapped against it, chipping bluing or splintering wood. Bullets smashed into sod, throwing little puffs of dust into the air, or punched through thin spots in the walls and whined past ears inside, close enough that men felt the wind of their passage. At Hanrahan's, Billy Dixon shifted from his earlier position and took a different gap on the north side. He knew that anyone who stayed too long at one hole would draw careful aim from the flats and sooner or later take a hit. He rested his Sharps rifle again, peered through the slit, and saw a pair of warriors sharing a hollow near an overturned section of corral rail, their bodies almost completely hidden except when one lifted his head to sight along a carbine. Dixon waited, patient despite the burning in his eyes and the pounding in his skull. When one of the men rose a little higher, lining up a shot toward Myers and Leonard's store, Dixon exhaled, took up the slack on the trigger and sent a single round downrange. The figure collapsed sideways into the hollow and did not reappear. Inside the same building, a hunter with a Winchester watched a different sector, trading shots with a marksman who had found shelter behind the Shadler brothers' wagon. Each exchange sent splinters and slivers from the wagon side into the air. The canvas cover sagged in places where rounds had cut through its supports, creating an eerie flutter above the two still bodies lying beside the wheels. In Myers and Leonard's store, the Oz defenders worked under a constant tapping on their walls. Rounds from distant rifles struck sod and boards with steady rhythm, a hard, dry sound that never fully stopped. Hunters crouched behind stacks of flour and coffee, waited for the moment when a flash of movement appeared beyond their gaps, then answered with short, sharp volleys. One man from that building, whose hand had been torn earlier, sat near the rear, his injured fingers wrapped in a bulky bandage. He used his good hand to help with loading duties, cracking open breeches, easing empty shells from chambers, sliding fresh rounds into place, and passing firearms forward to men at the windows who still had both arms strong enough to fire. Rath and Wright's store remained under pressure from a different angle. Warriors focused more effort on that side of the hill, using the shallow drainage lines that fed into the creek to creep closer. Shots punched into the rear of the building, searching for weak points. The men inside answered whenever they could see anything to shoot at, but they also spent time shoring up their walls from within, dragging more sacks, barrels, and bundles into layered barricades until only narrow firing slits remained. Near mid-afternoon, a brief lull settled over part of the field as some warriors withdrew to check their horses and talk with leaders who had gathered behind a line of low mounds beyond easy rifle range. Their voices carried only as broken shreds of sound to the men inside the buildings, who could not make out the words, but understood that decisions were being made. Quanah Parker rode along the rear of his line, listening to reports from fighters who had been in the front since dawn. They told him how many times they had tried to approach the doors, how often their efforts had torn up horses and left warriors lying in the dust. Faces tight with fatigue and anger surrounded him, men who had expected a quick breaking of the settlement now looking back at hours of hard fighting and dead companions. Not far from that knot of leaders, Isatai stood with a cluster of supporters. The medicine man's paint had run in streaks from sweat, but he kept his posture high. When questioned, he insisted that his medicine had not failed. He said that some warriors had not obeyed instructions closely enough, that others had ridden into fire when they should have waited for his signal, and that the powers he served still stood ready to protect them if they attacked in the exact way he directed. Some listened with unbroken faith, nodding and repeating his reassurances to those around them. Others looked out toward the hill where the 3 buildings still stood intact and said little, weighing what their own eyes told them against his confident words. Grief already sat on those men. They knew the names of riders who would not be returning to the camps near the Red River. Back inside Adobe Walls, the hunters used that slight easing of pressure to shift positions and tend to urgent tasks. Hanrahan picked 2 men and told them to check the roof beam again. They set ladders against the interior wall, climbed up and felt along the wood with their hands. The brace they had added before dawn held firm. The beam still bowed, but no new cracks had appeared. They climbed down with a little more confidence that the roof would not drop on them before nightfall. Hannah Olds moved through the saloon carrying a bucket of water and a dipper, handing drinks to men at the wall in quick turns. Their thanks came as short nods and hoarse whispers. She also checked on the wounded in the back corner, adjusting bandages and wiping sweat from faces with a rag fetched from a crate of spare cloth. Dixon and Masterson joined Hanrahan at a table where cartridges lay in rows. Together they looked over what remained. Wooden boxes that had been heavy in the morning now stood empty or nearly so. They still had significant reserves, but they no longer felt that ammunition was something they could spend without thought. They talked in low tones about conserving fire. Shots would now go only at clear targets, no more answering every flash of color or random movement beyond the walls. Dixon reminded the younger men to hold their fire until they could see a man well enough to place a round where it would count. Later in the afternoon, as air above the ground began to shimmer and visibility wavered, warriors tried a different tactic. Small parties moved toward the creek bed and began digging into its banks to create deeper slots from which they could fire. They used knives, bare hands, and whatever tools they carried to scoop earth from the vertical faces and flatten shelves where they could lie almost completely hidden. From those new positions, they sent rounds upward at steep angles. Bullets punched into undersides of roofs and cut into eaves. A few came through the upper parts of walls and struck rafters, sending small showers of clay and dried grass into rooms already thick with dust. Men inside reacted by lowering their own firing positions, kneeling or even lying prone to work the loopholes, trying to keep as little of their bodies exposed as possible. Near the blacksmith shop, which had taken heavy damage earlier in the day, a group of warriors slipped into what remained of its structure. The forge had gone cold when its owner ran for cover in the morning, leaving tools scattered and the chimney standing as a broken stump. The attackers used the partial walls and collapsed roof beams as a screen, peering between gaps in the wreckage while they fired toward the nearest store. Rounds from inside Hanrahan's and Myers and Leonard's soon started to strike the remains of the blacksmith's place. Chips of adobe and wood flew from the ruins, and the warriors using that position found that every shot they fired drew answering fire so quickly that staying there meant accepting a high risk of being hit. After one man took a round through the chest and fell across the broken anvil, his companions pulled back to safer hollows. As the day wore on, the sun pressed down harder, drawing moisture from every surface. Lips cracked. Men's eyes burned. Powder residue stuck to sweat and formed dark streaks on cheeks and forearms. Horses outside panted with tongues hanging and flanks slick. Even those not yet wounded shuffled and drooped, their energy drained by hours of movement and strain. On one edge of the flats, a group of warriors made a concentrated effort to shoot the animals in the corrals. They knew that if they could kill or scatter all the stock, the hunters would be left on foot and would have a much harder time breaking out or hauling loads away later. They put repeated volleys into the railings, cutting down several horses and mules tied there. Men inside watched animals they had relied on crash against rails and fall. When the shooting slackened slightly, 2 hunters and the blacksmith himself rushed out the rear door of Rath and Wright's store to move the surviving stock into a lower pen that lay closer under the hill. They ran in short bursts, using wagon bodies and piles of hides as partial cover, shouting and slapping ropes against the animals to drive them toward the safer enclosure. Bullets kicked up dust around their feet as they worked. One mule screamed when a round grazed its hindquarter but still moved under the lash. The men reached the smaller pen, shoved the gate open and forced as many animals as they could inside before bolting back to the door, hearts hammering and lungs burning from the sprint and the near misses. Late in the afternoon, shadows began to stretch again. The light softened a little, though the air still felt like a blanket over skin. Gunfire did not stop, but its tempo slowed. Warriors who had been in forward position since mid-morning withdrew to drink from water skins and to talk with family members at the edges of the camp. In the alliance circle behind the lines, women tended to wounded men laid out on blankets under makeshift shade. Some injuries were obvious and fatal. Others were ragged bullet paths through limbs or shoulders that at least offered a chance of survival if bleeding could be controlled and infection somehow held at bay. Relatives washed wounds with precious water, chewed herbs to make simple poultices, and sang quietly to men whose eyes stared past them toward the hill. Out of earshot, leaders spoke together again. They had to decide whether to stay into the night or pull back entirely. Pride tugged them one way. Caution tugged them another. The number of dead already weighed heavily on them. So did the knowledge that every further hour of fighting under those walls threatened to add more bodies to the tally. Quanah listened to those arguments and looked more than once toward the distant fortifications, measuring their angles, thinking of the rifles inside and of the men whose steady shooting had canceled every attempt at a new rush. He agreed to keep the pressure on through the night but changed tactics again, ordering warriors to stay where they could fire from cover at intervals and prevent the defenders from relaxing or venturing far from the buildings. As dusk drew closer, the men inside the settlement faced decisions of their own. With light fading, anything that required movement outside the walls had to be done quickly. They still needed to deal with the bodies of the Shadler brothers and the dog near the wagon. The corpses had lain in the sun since morning, and leaving them exposed any longer felt unbearable to men who had worked beside them on the trail. Dixon, Masterson, and a few others volunteered for the task. They selected a moment when incoming fire had eased slightly, then unbarred a side door and stepped out in a crouch, rifles in one hand and shovels in the other. Others inside the building spread out along the walls and windows, to deliver covering fire the instant any movement appeared on the flats. The small burial party walked quickly across the yard, boots crunching on dry earth and on debris scattered by the morning's fighting. They reached the wagon, grabbed the bodies by shoulders and ankles, and dragged them a short distance to a spot near the base of the hill where the ground was soft enough to cut. Shovels bit into the soil while bullets from distant positions snapped overhead. Dirt flew in uneven strokes, the men working as fast as they could without losing all precision. The dog's body followed the brothers into the shallow trench, laid at their feet. A few brief words were spoken, more a rough promise than a formal prayer. Then soil-covered faces and limbs until only mounds remained. The burial party ran back under a fresh burst of fire. One man stumbled when a round struck near his heel and sprayed his leg with fragments, but he kept moving. Hands dragged them through the door and slammed the bar into place again. Inside, chests heaved. Sweat dripped freely. Yet the knowledge that their dead now lay under earth rather than in the open brought a small, grim satisfaction. As daylight faded further, a different kind of quiet settled over the field. Shots still came from creek beds and ridges, but fewer. Warriors did not risk open charges now. They conserved ammunition as much as the defenders did. Each side listened for the other, trying to sense any change that might signal a shift in the fight. Inside the buildings, lamps were lit but kept low, wicks turned down to thin tongues of flame. Too much light behind a window could outline a man and draw an easy shot from outside. Hunters ate what food they could snatch between turns at the loopholes, chewing quickly on cold meat, hard bread, or jerked buffalo that someone had brought from stores untouched by the day's chaos. Hannah Olds and a couple of others kept coffee going in blackened pots, the bitter drink moving from hand to hand in tin cups. It did not remove fatigue, but it took some of the dullness from men's eyes and helped them stay upright when their bodies wanted to sag against walls and sleep where they leaned. In quiet stretches, talk turned to the possibility of a relief force. Some believed that freighters or scouts had already carried word toward Dodge City. Others argued that no one outside yet knew what had happened, and that they would have to find their own way out once the attackers finally drifted away. In those brief conversations, voices stayed low and steady. No one allowed panic to edge in. Night finally closed over Adobe Walls, with stars returning above the valley. Out on the flats, small campfires burned low and scattered. Warriors and their families ate, tended to injured, and rested in shifts. A few riders still moved between positions, checking on forward posts where men lay with rifles across their arms, ready to fire at any figure that stepped beyond the walls below. Inside the stores and saloon, guards were posted at every side. Men took turns lying down on bare floor or on bunks, boots still on, guns within reach, catching short stretches of shallow sleep before being shaken awake to relieve someone else. The wounded groaned quietly in corners, some drifting in and out of awareness, others staring at rafters and listening to the distant calls outside. The heat eased only slightly during the night. Air moved through window gaps and under door cracks, carrying the smell of trampled grass, blood, and smoke. The men in Adobe Walls lay in that mix of odors and sounds, knowing that dawn would bring another test and that the rifles around them would have to answer it with the same steadiness they had shown since the first charge. Toward the darkest hour, just before the first thin gray once again touched the eastern edge of the sky, faint noises drifted from the distant ridgelines. Horses stamped and snorted, voices rose and fell in low tones. War leaders gathered again to decide how to face the new day. The defenders inside could not see those preparations, but they felt the tension that came with every approaching morning in a siege. And each man who lay with eyes closed knew that, when light returned, he would be back at a loophole with gun in hand, watching for shapes against the flats that had already run red once and could do so again. June 28, 1874, opened with a flat gray light over Adobe Walls, the first full day after the charge, and the men inside the 3 sod buildings looked out through their loopholes at a killing ground that stretched from each doorway to the creek bed and low hills beyond. Dead horses lay in irregular rows around the foot of the rise, some on their sides with legs stiff, some twisted under saddles, stirrups and bridles tangled. Several warrior bodies lay among them, arms flung out, faces turned toward the sky. No one from the Alliance had risked coming close enough during the night to drag those men away, and the stillness of those forms told the defenders that they would not rise again. Inside Hanrahan's saloon, men unfolded themselves from floors and bunks with the stiffness of bodies that had slept in full clothing and boots. Every joint seemed to protest. Shoulders ached from hours of firing. Eyes felt rubbed raw from powder smoke and lack of rest. Billy Dixon pushed himself up, rubbed grit from his lids, and felt his way toward his familiar position at one of the wall gaps without needing to be told. Outside, Comanche, Kiowa, and Southern Cheyenne riflemen still held positions in creek beds, hollows, and behind low rises. As the light strengthened, their fire resumed. Single shots cracked from the flats, sending bullets into sod and plank. Some rounds struck the dead horses, punching new holes in bodies that no longer felt them. Others struck the walls and rafters, shaking loose clods of dry earth that rained into the rooms. The hunters answered in measured fashion. No one could afford to throw away cartridges. Each man at a loophole watched patiently, waiting for a shoulder, a hat brim, or a muzzle flash to give a target. Then a Sharps, Winchester, or Henry spoke, and a man outside twitched, slumped, or rolled backward out of sight. Soon after sunrise, a short lull opened on one side of the yard. The firing from that sector thinned, then stopped completely for several minutes. Inside Hanrahan's place, men glanced at one another, understanding that they needed to use that gap while they could. The heap of dead horses close to the walls had already begun to sour in the heat, and the carcasses blocked lines of fire and left narrow spaces where an attacker might dash forward under partial cover. Hanrahan chose 3 men, including Dixon, and told them plainly what needed doing. They would drag the nearest horse bodies farther down slope or off to the side so the rifles inside could see the approaches more clearly. The task would be miserable and dangerous, but leaving the animals where they lay would cause worse trouble later. Bars came off a side door. The 3 men burst out with ropes over their shoulders, rifles slung, and moved at a half-crouch down the slope. The stench hit them first, a thick, heavy smell from open guts and blood baked one full morning under an open sky. They looped ropes around hind legs and heaved. Muscles strained as hooves dug ruts through the dirt. Flies already clustered in clouds around torn hides, buzzing into eyes and mouths as the men worked. Dixon felt rounds snap past and heard bullets smack into carcasses and dirt nearby as he pulled. Comanche and Kiowa marksmen had not abandoned their rifles. They shifted aim and fired whenever a man stood exposed on the slope. Covering fire from the loopholes cracked overhead as hunters inside tried to drive distant riflemen to ground long enough for their own men to move the dead. One of the 3 fell with a shout when a bullet grazed his calf. The wound ripped skin and muscle but did not break bone. He swore, staggered upright, and refused to go inside until he had helped drag one more horse clear of the wall. Only when the gap at that point opened enough for a clear field of view did he allow himself to be pushed back through the door, where Hannah Olds tied a strip of cloth around his bleeding leg. By late morning of that second day, many of the closest carcasses had been shifted enough to clear new sight lines, and the dirt immediately around the buildings was littered with drag marks and stained patches where blood had soaked deep. Near the bottom of the slope, the heaviest piles of bodies now lay in tangled heaps, hooves and horns projecting at odd angles, a rough barrier between the rise and the open flats. While this work went on, other changes reached Adobe Walls. Dust on the horizon to the east marked the approach of new wagons and riders. During the night and early morning, word of the attack had spread through hunting camps on the Canadian. Men who had been skinning or scouting miles away now drove hard for the settlement, knowing that if Adobe Walls fell, no shelter would remain in that stretch of country. By midday, George Belfield's outfit rolled into view, their wagons pushing through the same crossings and ruts the Dodge City train had used days earlier. Belfield and his men saw the scattered dead horses and the circling riders beyond the hill. They snapped whips over their teams and forced the animals into a final, punishing pull up the slope and into the yard. Hunters inside shouted for doors to be opened just long enough to let the newcomers through. Belfield's men leaped from wagon seats and ran the last yards with rifles already in their hands. Bullets from the flats nipped at their heels and punched splinters from wagon sides. But no one in that group fell before they dove through doorways that slammed behind them. Soon afterward, Jim and Bob Cater arrived with their own men. They had also heard that warriors were on the move and that Adobe Walls lay under attack. Rather than stay scattered in small camps, they chose to gather where walls and numbers gave at least a chance of survival. Their arrival raised the count of defenders and brought fresh rifles and ammunition into the rooms. The second day also brought a different kind of volunteer. Henry Lease listened to the short, grim discussions that took place in corners between volleys. Men knew that more cartridges, food, and possibly soldiers would come if Dodge City received word. No one could be sure that any messenger would survive the ride. Lease stepped forward and said he would try. Preparations for his run took place in small bursts between exchanges of fire. Lease chose a strong, fast horse from the surviving animals in the lower pen. Men tightened the cinch and checked hooves and tack as carefully as if they were preparing for a long race. They handed him a rifle, a revolver, and a cartridge belt filled as heavily as weight and comfort would allow. A few scribbled short notes on scraps of paper that carried numbers of defenders and basic details of the attack, then folded them and tucked them into his shirt. He waited in the shadow of one wall until late afternoon when the light on the flats began to change and the warriors' fire slackened again. Then at a shouted warning from a lookout, the bar came off the rear door closest to the lower pen. Lease dashed out, swung into the saddle in one motion, and drove his heels into the horse's sides. The animal lunged forward and down the slope, hooves pounding through dust and around carcasses. Warriors on the flats saw the movement and fired from several directions. Bullets snapped through the air around horse and rider, striking dirt and dead animals in sudden bursts. Lease hit the bottom of the slope, bent low over the horse's neck, and pushed straight toward a shallow draw that led east. Covering fire from Sharp's rifles and Winchesters on the hill picked at any rider who moved to intercept him. Several warriors gave chase, but the first seconds of delay were enough. Lease vanished into the folds of the land, dropping into a dry wash and then rising again farther out, moving from hollow to hollow until distance and ground features hid him. Darkness settled on that second night with both sides still facing one another. Inside the buildings, the new arrivals took their turns at the loopholes, giving some of the men who had fired since dawn on the first day a chance at longer rest. Outside, warriors gathered around low fires again, talking in grim tones about the dead and wounded lying in the flats and near the hill. On June 29th, the third day after the initial charge, the pattern of sporadic firing and watchfulness continued through morning and early afternoon. More hunters arrived in small groups, slipping through the lines in the same tense way Bellfield's and the Cater's outfits had done. Each arrival strengthened the defense and reminded the warriors watching from the ridges that every day they remained at Adobe Walls gave the buffalo hunters more guns rather than fewer. By that third day, the number of men inside the buildings had risen to several dozen. The rooms felt even more crowded. Heat built faster. Voices carried less because men had to speak directly into one another's ears to be heard over the constant background of rifle reports and the low moans of wounded men in corners. Midday passed and a kind of uneasy stalemate settled in. The warriors could not close with the walls without paying a high price. The hunters could not step far outside without attracting fire from every rifle within range. The flats lay between them, scarred by hoof marks, dotted with bodies and shimmering under the sun. In mid-afternoon of that third day, a group of warriors on the far side of the field decided to ride to higher ground to see the settlement from a new angle. 15 men mounted and moved out at a walk, then at an easy trot, angling to a bluff that rose nearly a mile away from the buildings. They were not charging. They sat upright in their saddles and carried themselves like men who expected to watch rather than be shot at. From the hill, hunters inside Adobe Walls watched them go. At first, some believed the warriors were simply shifting position. As the 15 reached the crest of the distant bluff and reined in their horses, it became clear that they were pausing to study the post. They sat in a rough line along the edge, horses outlined against the sky, bodies turned toward the cluster of buildings on the rise. One of the hunters, standing near Dixon and Hanrahan's saloon, looked out through a slit and stared at the tiny figures. He knew Dixon's reputation with a rifle and spoke up in a tone that carried both challenge and a kind of desperate humor. He said that if Dixon was the shooter everyone claimed he was, he ought to take a shot at those men and prove it. The distance seemed extreme even to an experienced plains hunter. Dixon had spent years judging ranges across open country, and his first instinct was that those riders lay far beyond the point where an aimed shot could be counted on to hit. Yet the suggestion lodged in his mind. The men on the bluff had chosen that spot because they believed they stood out of reach. If one of them fell from a bullet fired from the hill, it would send a clear message across the whole field. Hanrahan had a heavy Sharps rifle in his racks, chambered for a long-range cartridge that carried more powder and a heavier bullet than most of the guns in the rooms. He brought it out and handed it to Dixon without ceremony. The weapon weighed more than the rifle Dixon usually carried. Its thick barrel and strong stock showed the work of a gun built for distance and power. Dixon stepped outside the saloon, choosing the side of the building where the sod walls and the lay of the slope gave the most cover from direct rifle fire on the flats. Men inside and in the other stores shifted to loopholes that watched the same sector, ready to put down covering fire on anyone who tried to hit him while he worked. He moved to a slight rise a short distance from the wall that gave a clearer line of sight to the bluff without exposing his full body. There he lay prone, dug his elbows into the dirt, and rested the Sharps across a small, flat stone. He took time to steady his breathing and to line up the sights. The heat shimmer between him and the distant figures made them waver. He had to pick one of the mounted men and hold on that point, trusting that the rifle and the cartridge would do what they had been built to do. Around him the yard fell quiet. Men in the buildings watched through slits and cracks. For a moment, even incoming fire from some positions dropped as warriors on the flats paused to see what this single hunter would attempt. The 15 men on the bluff sat their horses with easy confidence, unaware that a rifleman on the hill now counted heartbeats with his sights fixed on one of them. Dixon filled his lungs, let part of the air flow out, and then pressed the trigger. The Sharps roared. The recoil slammed into his shoulder and drove his body slightly backward in the dust. The heavy bullet left the muzzle and began its long arc across the flats, rising above the line between rifle and target and then dropping again as distance and gravity worked on it. The men at Adobe Walls could not see the bullet in flight. They could only watch the distant line of horses and riders and wait. After a delay that made clear just how far the shot had to travel, one of the mounted figures on the bluff jerked violently. The man pitched sideways and slid from his saddle to the ground. His horse, startled, bounded forward a few steps, then stopped, reins trailing. The other 14 warriors reacted instantly. Some wheeled their horses toward the fallen man. Others turned to look toward the hill at Adobe Walls, suddenly aware that the rifles inside those thick sod walls could reach farther than they had believed. Men inside the buildings let out short, sharp exclamations. The distance was so great that for a few seconds no one fully believed what they had seen. Once it sank in, a rough, low cheer moved along the interior walls. Dixon did not shout. He worked the rifle's lever, ejected the spent case, and stood up slowly, shoulder throbbing from the recoil. He had trusted his sight picture and the gun. The fall of the distant warrior confirmed that his hold and judgment of elevation had been right for that moment. Later, Army surveyors would measure the range at 1,538 yards from the rise where he lay to the crest of the bluff where the warrior fell. Other measurements would give slightly shorter distances, depending on the precise points chosen on the ground. None of those numbers changed the fact that a single shot from that rifle had killed a man at a distance that stunned everyone who witnessed it. For the Alliance watching from nearer positions, the meaning of that fall went beyond one death. Those 15 men on the bluff had not ridden there as casual spectators. They had gone to look over the post to show that they could sit in plain view and observe without risk. Seeing one of their number torn from the saddle from that range showed that nowhere within sight of Adobe Walls stood outside the reach of the buffalo hunters' rifles. Word of the shot spread quickly through the warrior camps. Men who had fought at closer ranges understood something about long guns, but even they had counted on a limit to effective distance. Now, that boundary shifted. The enemy inside the buildings was not simply hard to dislodge at close quarters. Those men could also kill at ranges that few in the alliance had believed practical. The effect on morale did not show itself in loud displays. It appeared in the way conversations changed when warriors spoke to one another, in the way some glanced more often toward the horizon rather than toward the hill, and in the growing space between riders and the settlement. Quanah Parker, already nursing a wound taken earlier in the fight, listened as scouts and fighters reported the incident. He had never doubted the power of the heavy rifles. He had seen what they did to horses and men at shorter ranges. The reach shown by Dixon's shot added another weight to the calculation of costs. Issa Tai faced harder questions. He had promised protection against bullets to men who rode into the first rush. Men had believed him when they charged. Bodies on the flats, dead horses piled under the sun, and a killed warrior on a bluff nearly a mile away now stood as direct evidence that the medicine he had claimed did not match the reality of lead and powder. Some of his staunchest followers still defended him. They said that the warriors who died must have broken taboos or failed to follow his instructions in some small way during the charge. Others did not speak in his defense. They had buried close kin in the last 2 days. They had seen men fall even when they wore paint, carried medicine bundles, and rode under every sign of spiritual favor they knew. As the third day wore into evening, attacks on the buildings weakened. The circle of scattered fire remained. No one inside Adobe Walls dared call the siege finished, but the tone of the fight had changed. The alliance shifted more of its people to the rear, moving wounded men and families farther from the hill. The remaining warriors settled into more distant positions from which they kept watch rather than launching bold assaults. On the fourth day, more hunters drifted in from outlying camps, bringing the number of defenders to near 100. The rooms grew tighter still. Men stepped over one another to reach loopholes. Conversations happened in quick bursts between firing turns. The newcomers added more rifles to the line and brought fresh eyes to the shooting, finding new angles on positions where warriors had grown careless and exposing them to sudden lethal shots from the walls. The warriors outside watched those arrivals with growing concern. They had come into the valley expecting to wipe out 28 men and 1 woman in a handful of minutes, to burn the buildings and to clear the hunting grounds by terror. Instead, each dawn and dusk now showed more hunters standing behind the sod walls, not fewer. Each day's fighting had cost additional horses and lives, while the settlement still stood, scarred and blood-stained but intact. The 5th day brought one last hard blow for the defenders that had nothing to do with the warriors outside. William Olds, the cook whose wife moved quietly through the rooms serving food and water, climbed a ladder inside Rath and Wright's store to reach supplies. His rifle was in his hands as he descended, habit and fear telling him never to be without it while the siege lasted. His foot slipped on a rung. He fell, and in the fall the gun discharged. The bullet entered his head and killed him instantly. Men who had endured repeated charges, sniping, and close calls froze at the sudden crack and the sight of Olds lying at the foot of the ladder. For a moment, the noise of the siege seemed distant compared to that sight. They lifted his body gently and laid him out beside the others who had already been killed in the fight, including the Shadler brothers and Billy Tyler. Olds had spent his days feeding the hunters and tending to their needs. Now he joined those who had died by bullet or club in the defense of the post, even though the shot that killed him had come from his own weapon. By then, the alliance outside had reached its own limit. The warriors had lost men in the first charge, in the day-long exchanges around the walls, and on the bluff where Dixon's shot had struck. Quanah's injury weighed on their spirit. The failure of Isatai's promised protection hung over their counsels. Each day they stayed under the hill increased the risk that more men would die without changing the outcome. In quiet conversations away from the forward positions, leaders agreed that continuing to hammer at Adobe Walls would only feed more lives into the mouths of the hunters' rifles. They had shown that they could gather a strong force and ride deep into country that the buffalo hunters had treated as their own. They had demonstrated that they could strike fear into scattered camps and into the settlement itself. They had also met a defense backed by weapons that outranged and outmatched the guns most of their men carried. Gradually, without ceremony, the siege loosened. Groups of warriors slipped away from advanced hollows and creek banks in the night, riding back toward the main camps with wounded men held in front of them or supported between two horses. The remaining fighters kept up occasional fire to disguise the thinning line, but the pattern of shots grew sparser with each passing hour. The men inside Adobe Walls noticed the change only in small ways at first. Long stretches passed with no bullet striking their walls. When they peered through their slits at dawn on the 6th day, they saw fewer riders on the distant rises. Dust plumes from large moving groups now trailed away from the valley rather than toward it. Cautious steps outside confirmed what their eyes told them. Scouts from the buffalo hunters' side crossed the yard, moved down the slope, and reached the flats where dead horses and warriors still lay. No sudden shots cut them down. They climbed to low rises beyond and scanned the horizon. The main body of the alliance had gone. The Battle of Adobe Walls had not ended in a single dramatic moment of surrender or final charge. It closed with the slow withdrawal of an attacking force that could not break the defenses and refused to lose more men under walls that their rifles could not crack. The warriors left the valley carrying grief, anger, and the memory of men killed at close range and at a distance that they had not believed possible. Behind the sod walls, the buffalo hunters and tradesmen counted their dead and wounded, walked once more around the scarred buildings, and looked down at the flats where horses and men still lay. 4 of their own had died during the days of fighting and siege. Several more carried wounds that would mark them for the rest of their lives. They had held the post, but they understood that the struggle on the southern plains had only entered a new stage. Before the week ended, some of them would head toward Dodge City, including Hanrahan, Masterson, and Dixon, riding along the same trails they had followed days earlier when Adobe Walls had seemed a rough but ordinary outpost in buffalo country. Now every rut and landmark carried the memory of the attack, the siege, and a single long shot that had told every warrior on the bluff that the reach of the buffalo hunters' rifles could not be escaped simply by riding high and sitting still. The morning the last scouts admitted that no more riders watched from the bluffs. The men inside the sod buildings finally stepped far from the walls without expecting another rush through the grass. They walked the slope with rifles still in their hands, boots sinking into torn soil stamped by countless hooves. And they took in the scene in full daylight instead of through loopholes and door cracks. Warrior bodies lay within easy rifle distance of the stores and saloon, frozen in the positions where bullets had dropped them while they tried to reach doors and windows. Others lay farther out with fallen horses, leather and beadwork stained dark where blood had spread under them. Down in the flats, dead animals lay so thick that the hunters had to pick careful paths between carcasses to reach the creek. They brought the Shadler brothers and Billy Tyler in from the places where they had died on that first morning. The freighters had fallen near their wagons where the mules had been hit in the first storm of gunfire. Tyler had dropped in a doorway with his hand still closed on a rifle. The men chose a strip of hard ground just north of the corral, broke it with shovels until the blades rang dull instead of sharp, and dug a single trench for all three. There were no prayers from a preacher, no measured speeches. The talk that rose over the open grave came from men who had hauled freight with the brothers, shared coffee with Tyler, and seen them alive at sunrise. They laid the bodies side by side, filled the trench, tamped the earth flat with the backs of their shovels, and walked away knowing that only those who had stood there would ever know the exact spot. William Olds rested on a separate knoll southeast of Rath's store. His death had come not under a mounted charge, but in the drawn-out stretch of the siege, when the accidental blast of his own gun on a ladder had torn away the top of his head while his wife watched from the room below. Men who had stayed steady under hooves and war cries had flinched when they saw Mrs. Olds rush forward and catch sight of his body tumbling at her feet. They dug his grave in silence while she sat apart, and they packed the dirt over him with more care than they had given to their own parapets. When they finished, no one tried to explain anything. Each man knew that a step on a rung, the angle of a barrel, or a hand on a trigger could have changed names without changing the scene. Once the graves were in place, the work turned to the dead horses and oxen that still lay around the buildings. Many carcasses had already been dragged away from the walls during the siege, so they would not shield another rush, but enough remained to rot in the heat. Hides had split at bullet wounds, ribs pushed against stretched skin, and clouds of flies lifted in thick waves from every wound. The men tied cloth around their mouths and noses, walked from body to body, and finished any animal that still trembled or tried to struggle upright. Ropes went around legs and necks, and teams pulled carcasses into heaps where fire could reach them. When flames took hold, layers of greasy smoke rolled low over the slope. The smell of scorched hair, burned flesh, and hot blood hung in the valley and drifted into every building. Men worked until shoulders knotted and hands burned from rope fibers and shovel handles. Soot streaked their faces and darkened their shirts. No one spoke in long sentences. They hitched, hauled, dragged, and rolled until the worst piles shrank into black mounds. Every carcass that turned to ash erased one raw reminder of that first crash of hooves and guns at dawn. But each fire also underlined how much had died there in a single day. Even as they cleaned the ground close to the walls, every eye still checked the ridges. Scouts kept moving in short circles from the post, riding out to low hills and scanning the horizon before looping back. They found cold campfires, scorched patches where warriors had burned belongings before moving on, and blood-soaked spots where wounded riders had lain in the grass. Trails led away in several directions. Hoof marks pressed deep in the soft ground where the alliance had broken into scattered bands. None of those tracks turned back toward the ruined outpost. Far from the valley, Henry Lease finished the task that had begun when he slipped out of Adobe Walls under darkness and rode east with a borrowed horse and a rifle across his lap. He had followed faint wheel ruts and landmark ridges through prairie that held its own dangers, sleeping only in short stretches and pushing his mount until foam whitened the animal's chest. When he reached Dodge City, dust coated his clothes, sweat had dried in pale streaks on his face, and his horse stood with head low and sides heaving. Lease found Charles Rath and Robert Wright and gave a clear account of the attack, the siege, the dead men buried near the walls, and the numbers of warriors who had tried to overrun the three buildings. The merchants moved at once, hiring riders, stocking wagons, and sending word along the telegraph line that a large Indian force had struck deep in the Buffalo Range. The wire carried that report into army posts where staff officers already watched lists of raids lengthen from the southern plains. They read that fewer than 30 buffalo hunters and tradesmen had held Adobe Walls, that 4 white defenders lay in the ground near the settlement, and that many more Comanche, Kiowa, and Southern Cheyenne warriors than that had fallen under heavy rifles. The fight fit neatly into a pattern they had tracked for years. Treaty lines broken, hunters pushing into reserved hunting grounds, warriors striking out at stage lines and settlements, and each blow answered with patrols too small to shut down the cycle. For commanders who saw the Texas Panhandle and the Staked Plains as the last stronghold of free-roaming bands, Adobe Walls served as a hard jolt, proof that warriors still had enough strength to gather in force and strike where they chose. General Philip Sheridan and William Tecumseh Sherman did not intend to wait through another season of scattered raids. Orders moved down the chain of command to officers who knew the country by river and ridge name. The directive was blunt. Troops would not sit behind stockade walls and chase raiding parties after families had died in scattered ranches or small towns. Columns would move into the broken land between the Canadian Red and Washita rivers, find every remaining village, destroy lodges and food stores, and seize or kill horse herds. Once that work was finished, there would be no place left on the high plains where a band could winter without depending on government agencies and ration houses. By late summer of 1874, cavalry and infantry from Fort Dodge, Fort Supply, Fort Sill, and posts to the south and east pushed into the same broad country where the alliance that rode against Adobe Walls had gathered. Nelson Miles took columns along the Canadian and its branches. Ranald Mackenzie led the 4th Cavalry toward the canyons that cut the edge of the Llano Estacado. John Davidson and George Buell moved forces across other stretches of the Panhandle, while Tonkawa and other Allied scouts rode ahead to read the sign. Buffalo hunters who had once drifted from camp to camp now wore Army-issue clothing and carried government rifles, guiding these columns over trails that wound through mesquite, sand draws, and narrow passes. Among them rode Billy Dixon, who signed on with Miles weeks after leaving the wrecked settlement, trading the hunter's life for a scout's pay and the same dangers under a different flag. The campaign carried that same pattern day after day. Patrols slid into side canyons and surprised small camps, burned teepees and food caches, and drove off herds. When warriors tried to screen families as they fled deeper into rough country, the soldiers pressed them until they broke into smaller groups. One clash near a shallow depression scooped out long earlier by buffalo hooves turned 6 men into the center of a fight that matched the desperate feel of Adobe Walls. On September 12, 1874, Dixon and fellow scout Amos Chapman rode with 4 6th Cavalry troopers as they carried dispatches across open prairie. Kiowa and Comanche riders swarmed them and dropped horses and men in a few minutes of hard firing. The survivors crawled into the low earthen basin and piled up what cover they could at its rim. All day long they fired from that narrow circle of dirt while mounted warriors circled, darted in, and tried to crawl close through grass. When cold rains swept in near nightfall and darkness finally wrapped the ground, the 6 men were still alive, though every one of them carried bullet wounds, and the body of one trooper lay under wet blankets at the edge of the wallow. Farther south, the campaign cut even deeper, into the heart of plains life. Mackenzie followed trails into Palo Duro Canyon, where Comanche, Kiowa, and Cheyenne families believed they had found a hidden refuge along the stream that twisted through colored cliffs. On September 28th, his command picked its way down into that gorge, single file along steep paths where rock crumbled under hooves and men had to cling to reins and brush. When they reached the valley floor, they rode into villages that stretched along the water, lodges pitched under cottonwoods and on grassy benches, cooking fires still ringed with stones, meat racks standing with strips of buffalo drying in the weak autumn sun. Warriors scrambled for rifles and tried to hold the canyon walls, firing down while women and children fled up side draws with whatever they could lift. There was no long standoff. The troops pushed from cluster to cluster until guns fell silent, and the canyon floor filled with abandoned property. Then Mackenzie turned his men loose on the material that held these bands together. Soldiers cut down teepees, slashed through parfleche bags, kicked apart sacks of dried meat, and shoved trunks, utensils, and tools into piles. Lodge poles broke under boot heels and rifle butts. Blankets, robes, and clothing went onto the same heaps. When everything lay in tangled mounds, fire climbed through the mess and sent long, dirty columns of smoke sliding along the canyon walls. That same day, troopers and scouts rounded up a huge herd of Indian horses and mules. Mackenzie had the animals driven out of the canyon, and soon afterward, large groups were shot under guard so that the bands that had once prized them for war and hunting would never ride them again. Word of burned camps and dead horse herds traveled quickly from canyon to canyon and from stream to stream. Families that still clung to the last strongholds south and west of Adobe Walls listened to accounts from scouts and returning hunters and understood exactly what those stories meant. Winter had always been hard on the plains, even when lodges were tight, pemmican and dried meat filled storage bags, and herds grazed nearby. Without tents, food, and horses, it would not simply be hard. It would be impossible. Miles' columns hit other villages on the staked plains and along lesser-known creeks, burning everything that could shelter a family or feed a band. The number of bodies left on the ground sometimes ran low, but the damage carried by these fires and executions of horse herds cut far deeper than single battles. At the same time, the source of power that had fed warrior societies for generations suffered an even wider assault. Buffalo herds on the southern plains had been thinning for years, and the early 1870s brought a speed of killing that stunned even men who made their money from hides. Long trains carried stacks of salted skins east, and plains towns grew piles of bleached bones waiting for shipment to factories. Where hunters like Dixon had once watched dark masses of animals move from horizon to horizon, riders now saw more open ground than moving backs when they topped a rise. The animal that had fed, clothed, housed, and armed the Comanche, Kiowa, and Cheyenne in so many ways no longer offered a secure base for life outside the reservation lines. Hungry families drifted toward agency posts as winter closed in. Some arrived in small knots, leading tired horses and carrying a few remaining bundles. Others surrendered in lines that stretched from wagons back to riders and then to men and women on foot. Officers counted heads, listed band names, and sent the new arrivals to clusters of frame buildings and canvas tents that had replaced buffalo hide lodges. Rations, coarse clothing, and unfamiliar rules waited for them there. Each new arrival meant one fewer group of warriors riding free along the Canadian or the Red, and one more group tied to an issue day at a government storehouse. Quanah Parker felt that weight tighten on the last roaming Quahati Comanche band. He had carried his lance through the charge at Adobe Walls and watched hunters and heavy rifles turn that assault into a retreat. He had led warriors and families through the Red River campaign, always looking for a new canyon or plain that might shelter them, only to find columns driving in from several directions. By the spring of 1875, his following had worn-out horses, thin children, and elders who could not endure another season of flight. On June 2nd, he brought his people into Fort Sill and surrendered, giving the army the last large Comanche group still living entirely from horse herds and the chase. For Isatayi, the medicine man whose vision and promises had helped bring riders to Adobe Walls, the months after the campaign carried a different kind of reckoning. The same warriors who had once trusted his claim that bullets would not pierce them now lived with scars that proved otherwise. Families that had buried sons and brothers did not forget the words he had spoken in the lodge before the ride toward the Canadian. On the reservation, he carried a name and a memory that reminded everyone of a day when faith in protection had met the reality of large-caliber rifles and fallen short. The buffalo hunters who had beaten back the charge had their own paths through the new landscape. Dixon continued as a scout for Miles and other officers along the Texas Panhandle and in Indian Territory, riding ahead of columns carrying messages through dangerous country, and fighting in more than one tight spot where cover ran thin and bullets flew close. Bat Masterson stepped away from the hunting grounds and took on law work in cattle and railroad towns, wearing a badge in streets lined with saloons, dance halls, and gambling rooms that owed their existence to the same changes that had emptied the Buffalo Ranges. Other men from Adobe Walls turned to ranching, freighting, or settled trades in Kansas and Colorado, or simply went back east, worn down by years of risk and sudden violence. Adobe Walls as a living settlement faded quickly. Merchants recovered what goods they could, hauled the best stock back toward Dodge City, and shut their doors. A few men stayed behind to guard leftover supplies, but orders from the army eventually drove even those holdouts away. The officers did not want a civilian outpost sitting alone in such exposed country, drawing attacks that might pull troops from the main campaign. When warriors returned and found the place empty, they burned the remaining buildings rather than leave them standing as a trading point in the center of ground that had once been theirs. Wind, rain, and time worked on the rubble, softening sod, collapsing walls, and spreading adobe dust across the slope. Years later, when fences stretched across the panhandle and cattle grazed in pastures where buffalo had once traveled in seasonal paths, local citizens and historians came back to the rise above Adobe Walls Creek. They marked the ground with monuments and stones so that the scene would not vanish entirely under grass. Visitors walked where the corral had stood, where the store walls had risen, and where the saloon had leaned under its sod roof. They looked toward the bluff beyond the creek, now quiet and empty, and tried to match the view before them with accounts of mounted riders packed so tightly that no space showed between horses, of rifle smoke drifting from windows, and of a single shot that toppled a distant figure from the saddle. The fight that had started with a cracked roof beam waking a cluster of hunters ended with a long campaign that burned camps across hundreds of miles and drove the last free riders into a fort. The warriors who had expected a swift victory over 3 scattered buildings found instead a killing ground where technology, ammunition, and steady hands turned open prairie into a trap. From the ruined walls, the line of consequence ran through the Red River War. The slaughter of herds, the destruction of villages, and the final surrender of Comanche, Kiowa, and Cheyenne bands. After Adobe Walls, no small frontier post on the southern plains could be taken for granted as easy prey, and no mounted alliance on that ground would again ride with the same confidence that a quick rush would carry the day.